Beneath the manicured moss gardens and the silent, imposing castles that dot the Japanese landscape, a deeper history sleeps. We picture the samurai, a solitary figure with a glistening katana, the embodiment of honor and martial perfection. But long before this image was forged, in the mists of a Japan that had not yet found its name, other warriors rode the land. In the vast, keyhole-shaped burial mounds that pockmark the countryside, archaeologists find not swords, but the clay figures of armored men on horseback, their hands poised to draw a bow. These silent Haniwa figures guard the secrets of a forgotten age, a time of clan chieftains and continental struggles that planted the seeds of a warrior class. They are a mystery, the ghost progenitors of the samurai, and their story is one not of polished steel, but of earth, bronze, and the thundering of hooves across the plains of Yamato. This is the world that existed before the blade, the foundation upon which an entire legend would be built. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As our story begins in this ancient land, I'd love to know where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Please share in the comments below. Our journey begins not with a sword, but with a bow, and not on foot, but on horseback. The Japan of the early centuries, c. known to historians as the Kofun period, was a patchwork of powerful, competing clans, or uji. Each was led by a chieftain, who was as much a high priest as he was a warlord. His authority derived from his claimed descent from a patron kami, a divine spirit. These clans battled for control of the most fertile lands, primarily on the Kansai plain, the rice-rich heartland from which the dominant Yamato clan would eventually emerge. Warfare in this era was a chaotic affair, a clash of small clan-based warbands. The principal weapon was the bow, wielded with deadly accuracy from horseback. The sword existed, but it was a straight, double-edged blade called a tsurugi, a design imported from China and Korea, and it served more as a symbol of status and a sidearm than a primary weapon. The ideal warrior of this time was the mounted archer, a figure of speed and lethality, a stark contrast to the grounded swordsman who would dominate later centuries. The evidence for this world is buried in the earth itself. The great burial mounds, the Kofun from which the period takes its name, are treasure troves of information. Inside the tombs of the powerful chieftains, we find bronze mirrors, jade jewelry, and most importantly, the tools of war, iron helmets, lamellar armor made of small, laced-together plates, and the remnants of bows and arrows. Surrounding these mounds, standing in silent procession, are the Haniwa, those terracotta clay figures. They depict warriors, horses with saddles and stirrups, falconers and nobles, giving us a frozen diorama of the elite society of the time. The prevalence of horse-related figures speaks volumes. The horse was not native to Japan. It arrived from the Asian mainland, and its mastery became the key to military dominance. This raises one of the great historical mysteries of early Japan, the horse rider theory. Some scholars have hypothesized that the Yamato state wasn't an indigenous development at all, but was founded by conquering horse riders from the Korean peninsula who subjugated the native clans. While this theory is no longer widely accepted as a full-blown invasion, it points to the undeniable and profound influence of continental technology and military tactics on the formation of Japan's earliest warrior culture. The roots of the samurai, it seems, lie overseas. For centuries, this system of clan-based power, with the Yamato clan holding a position of first among equals, defined the political landscape. The Yamato chieftain eventually took on the title of Okimi, or Great King, and established a court that sought to emulate the sophisticated imperial systems of China. This culminated in the middle of the 7th century with a series of sweeping changes known as the Taika reforms. Inspired by the centralized bureaucracy of Tang China, the imperial court, now led by an emperor or tenno, sought to strip the independent clans of their power. They claimed all land as the property of the emperor, created a new system of taxation, and most crucially for our story, attempted to establish a national peasant conscript army. The idea was to create a loyal fighting force directly under the control of the central government, making the private armies of the regional clans obsolete. Every able-bodied male peasant was, in theory, now a soldier in the emperor's army. On paper, it was a brilliant plan to forge a unified state. In reality, it was an administrative nightmare. The government was simply not equipped to arm, train, and command such a vast force across a rugged and mountainous archipelago. The peasants themselves made for reluctant soldiers. Pulled away from the farms that were their entire livelihood, they were poorly motivated and often ill-equipped. A farmer handed a spear and told to march hundreds of miles to a distant frontier posting was far more concerned about his unharvested rice than the emperor's geopolitical ambitions. The great provincial clans, meanwhile, were ordered to disarm, but they were the ones who truly understood warfare and held the loyalty of the local populace. The conscript army proved woefully ineffective, particularly in the northern lands of Honshu, where the court was fighting a long and difficult campaign against the indigenous Emishi people, who were themselves fierce horsebowmen. The failure of this centralized military model created a dangerous power vacuum. The court in the capital needed a way to pacify the provinces and defend its borders, but its own national army wasn't up to the task. The solution, born of necessity, would change the course of Japanese history. The court began to abandon its own conscript system and instead delegate military authority back to the very people it had tried to supplant: the provincial elites, the masters of the horse and bow. They were, in essence, outsourcing violence, authorizing powerful local families to keep the peace. In doing so, they inadvertently created a new professional class of warriors, men whose entire lives were dedicated to the martial arts, bound by loyalty not to a distant emperor, but to a local lord. The age of the conscript was ending, and the age of the specialist, the mounted warrior for hire, was about to begin. These men were not yet called samurai, but they were sharpening the skills and forging the loyalties that would define them. This gradual delegation of power, a slow and almost reluctant admission of failure by the central government, coincided with one of the most remarkable cultural flowerings in Japanese history. In the year 794, the imperial court moved to a new, grand capital, a city laid out on a grid pattern modeled after the Tang Chinese capital of Chang'an. It was called Heian, the capital of peace and tranquility, and it would later be known to the world as Kyoto. For the next 4 centuries, this city would be the stage for a society of almost unparalleled aesthetic refinement. The life of the court nobility, the Kug, was a world unto itself. a delicate bubble of extreme luxury and intricate social ritual, almost completely insulated from the grit and grime of the world outside the city gates. An aristocrat's worth was measured not by his military prowess or administrative skill, but by his ability to compose a clever poem, to recognize a subtle blend of incense, or to choose a shade of silk robe whose color perfectly complemented the season. The court was a place of high drama, played out in whispers, glances, and beautifully penned notes delivered by servants. Both men and women of the court wore elaborate layers of silk, whitened their faces with rice powder, and blackened their teeth, which was considered a mark of beauty. The great literary masterpiece of the age, The Tale of Genji, written by the noblewoman Murasaki Shikibu, perfectly captures this insular world. It is a story not of war and politics, but of the romantic entanglements and aesthetic sensibilities of the shining prince, Genji. In its thousands of pages, the concerns of the provincial farmer, the fisherman, or the warrior barely register. They are a different species, living in a different world. This growing detachment between the capital and the provinces was the defining feature of the Heian period. While the nobles of Kyoto were debating the merits of a particular calligraphy stroke, the country they supposedly governed was becoming increasingly unruly. The court's authority, so absolute within the palace grounds, began to fray and dissolve the further one traveled from the capital. Out in the provinces, the problems that had doomed the old conscript army had only grown worse. Piracy was rampant on the vital inland sea, disrupting the flow of tax revenues and trade goods to the capital. On the northern frontier, the Emishi continued their fierce resistance. But the most significant challenge to central authority came from the land itself. The economic foundation of this era was the rise of the Shuin, vast, private, and most importantly, tax-exempt estates. These estates were often legally owned by powerful court aristocrats, influential Buddhist monasteries, or even members of the imperial family themselves, who used their connections in the capital to secure immunity from taxation. The actual estates, however, were hundreds of miles away, managed by local strongmen who were responsible for the land's productivity and security. These estate managers were the direct ancestors of the warrior class. Their job was to ensure the rice was grown, the rents were collected, and the estate was defended from bandits or predatory neighbors. To do this, they needed armed men, and so they began to gather and train private retinues of skilled warriors, men drawn from their own families and from the local gentry. These warriors' loyalty was not to the distant emperor in his silken robes, but to the provincial master who fed them, equipped them, and rewarded them with land. A very different social code was developing in these harsh, practical environments. It was a code based on personal loyalty, martial skill, and a fierce devotion to one's immediate lord. The court in Heian still held the ultimate authority, the sole power to grant legitimate court rank and titles. But the actual power, the monopoly on violence, as it were, was steadily draining from the center and pooling in the hands of these provincial warrior families. There is a great historical debate about how much real power the emperor held during this time. For much of the Heian period, the emperors were dominated by the powerful Fujiwara clan, who perfected a system of ruling as regents. They would marry their daughters to young emperors, and then, when a son was born, they would persuade the emperor to abdicate, placing their own infant grandson on the throne. The Fujiwara patriarch would then rule as regent for the child emperor, wielding all the power without being the emperor himself. This long period of Fujiwara dominance suggests that the imperial throne was already becoming a symbolic, religious authority rather than a true political one. The emperor performed the sacred rites that ensured the harmony of the cosmos, but the Fujiwara clan managed the state. This division between symbolic authority and actual power would become a recurring theme in Japanese history. It created a system where the courtier in the capital and the warrior in the provinces had a symbiotic, if often tense, relationship. The warrior needed the court noble to grant him the legal titles and legitimacy that justified his power. The court noble, in turn, needed the warrior's muscle to protect his provincial estates and enforce his will. For now, the balance held. The great families of the provinces were content to serve as the fangs and claws of the court. They sought promotion and recognition within the Heian system, not its overthrow. But as their strength grew, and as the court continued to recede into its own world of aesthetic perfection, it was only a matter of time before these two worlds would collide. The seeds of a new order, one ruled not by the pen but by the sword, were being sown in the rice paddies and mountain forts of the Japanese countryside. These provincial warriors, the fangs and claws of a distant and increasingly effete court, began to coalesce into a distinct social class. They were the bushi, a term that simply means warrior, while the word samurai, meaning one who serves or attendant, was also in use. In these early days, it often referred to lower-ranking retainers who served in close proximity to a noble. Bushi, however, captured the essence of this rising class. They were men of arms, defined by their profession, not just their service. Their lives were a stark rebuttal to the perfumed sensibilities of Heian-kyo. A bushi's world was one of hard-packed earth, the smell of horse sweat and oiled leather, and the constant thrumming tension of potential violence. Their training began in childhood and was relentless, focused on a core set of principles known as Kyuba no Michi, or the way of the bow and horse. This was the heart of their martial identity. The ideal warrior was not a stoic swordsman, but a master of mounted archery, capable of firing arrows with deadly precision while galloping at full speed. Their training exercises were brutal and practical. One form, called yabusame, involved riding down a track at high speed while attempting to hit 3 small wooden targets with blunted arrows. Another, inumono, or dog shooting, involved chasing and shooting at dogs within an enclosure, a practice that honed the skills needed to hit a moving, dodging target and was eventually made more humane by using padded arrows. Hunting was not a leisure activity, but an essential part of military training. A large-scale simulated battle against wild boar and deer that tested a warrior's horsemanship, archery, and ability to coordinate with his comrades. A warrior's horse was not merely a tool, but a trusted partner in battle, and the bond between rider and steed was essential for survival. This focus on the horse and bow dictated the entire design of their equipment. The armor of the Heian Bushi, the classic oyoroi, or great armor, was a heavy, box-like suit constructed of thousands of small iron or leather scales, or kozane, bound together with silk or leather cords, and lacquered for weatherproofing. It was designed specifically for a mounted archer. The large shield-like shoulder plates called sword, protected the warrior from arrows, while the construction of the chest plate left the arms remarkably free for drawing a bow. It was, however, exceedingly heavy and cumbersome, a terrible disadvantage for a warrior forced to fight on foot. The bow itself, the yumi, was a beautiful and uniquely Japanese weapon. Made of laminated strips of bamboo and wood, it was asymmetrical, with the grip positioned about the 2/3 of the way down. This unusual design allowed it to be wielded more easily on horseback, passing over the horse's neck without interference. It was a powerful weapon, requiring immense strength to draw, and in the hands of a master, it was the ultimate arbiter of the battlefield. But it was during this period that the weapon most associated with the samurai began to take its iconic shape. The early straight swords, the Chinese-style tsurugi, were gradually replaced by a new kind of blade, the tachi. This was a long, single-edged sword with a profound curve. The innovation was a direct response to the needs of cavalry warfare. A curved blade is far more effective for slashing at a target while riding past at speed, a much more natural and devastating motion than the thrusting required of a straight sword. The tachi was worn slung from the belt, with the cutting edge facing down, allowing for a smooth, sweeping draw on horseback. While the bow remained the weapon of prestige, the sword was becoming the soul of the bushi, a symbol of his status and his last resort in close combat. Beneath the armor and the weapons, an unwritten code of conduct was being forged in the crucible of provincial life. This was not the systematized, philosophical Bushido of later centuries, but a raw and practical warrior ethos. At its absolute center was the virtue of loyalty, chuki. A bushi's loyalty was owed first and foremost to his direct lord, the leader of his clan, the Toryo. This bond was often stronger than ties to one's own immediate family, and certainly stronger than any abstract duty to the emperor in Kyoto. To betray one's lord was the most unforgivable of sins. In exchange for this absolute loyalty, the lord provided for his retainers, rewarding their service with land, wealth, and most importantly, his protection. This intricate web of personal loyalties formed the true government of the provinces. Alongside loyalty was an intense focus on personal honor and the reputation of one's name, or meiyo. A warrior's public image was everything, and he was expected to display a fierce, almost reckless bravery in battle to uphold it. Cowardice brought a shame that stained not only the individual, but his entire family for generations. This obsession with honor and the fear of shame gave rise to one of the most chilling and debated practices associated with the samurai: ritual suicide, or seppuku. While the elaborate ceremony of later eras had not yet developed, the core idea of choosing a self-inflicted death over the dishonor of capture was taking root. The origins of this practice are murky. There are few, if any, reliable accounts of it from the very earliest period, leading some historians to believe it was a later development. But in a world where capture often meant a humiliating execution, taking one's own life could be seen as a final, defiant act of control. It was the ultimate demonstration of a warrior's resolve. The family itself operated as a military corporation. The clan leader commanded the allegiance of not only his immediate kin, but a network of branch families and allied clans, all bound by oaths and the promise of mutual support. War was a family affair, and a victory brought glory and spoils to the entire clan. This tight-knit, hierarchical, and intensely loyal social structure made the provincial Bushi clans formidable fighting forces, and their power was growing with every passing generation. The court in Heian, in its quest for tranquility, had unintentionally created a class of men who lived by and for war. For a time, the Heian court managed this delicate balancing act, using the great Bushi clans as provincial tools to maintain a semblance of order. But the power of these warrior families was growing far beyond that of mere servants. By the middle of the 12th century, two great clans, both of distant imperial descent, had come to dominate the political and military landscape, their rivalry simmering just beneath the placid surface of court life. The first was the Taira clan, also known by the Sino-Japanese reading of their name, Heike. Through shrewd political maneuvering, the Taira had successfully infiltrated the court itself. Their leader, the brilliant and ruthless Taira no Kiyomori, had followed the old Fujiwara playbook, marrying his daughter into the imperial line and eventually placing his own infant grandson, Hantaku, on the chrysanthemum throne. By the 1170s, the Taira controlled the levers of government, held the highest court titles, and possessed vast wealth from their control over maritime trade in the West. They had become, in effect, a new aristocracy, trading their rugged warrior ethos for the silken robes and intricate protocols of Kyoto. Their great rivals were the Minamoto or Genji. The Minamoto were the quintessential Eastern warriors, their power base firmly established in the wild Kanto Plain, a land that bred the finest horses and the toughest fighters. While the Taira had become courtiers, the Minamoto had remained Bushi to the core, their reputation built on generations of martial prowess. An earlier clash between the two clans, the Heiji Rebellion of 1160, had ended in a decisive victory for the Taira. The Minamoto leaders were executed, and their surviving sons were exiled to the provinces, their power seemingly broken forever. Taira no Kiyomori, in a fateful act of what he may have considered mercy, spared the lives of the youngest Minamoto boys, believing them to be no future threat. It was a mistake that would cost his clan everything. For 2 decades, the Taira reigned supreme, but their arrogance and their appropriation of courtly power bred deep resentment among both the old aristocracy and the other warrior clans. The storm finally broke in 1180. An imperial prince named Mochihito, who had been passed over for the throne in favor of the Taira-blooded Antoku, issued a formal call to arms, a command for the warriors of the realm to rise up and destroy the Taira usurpers. This provided the crucial justification, the legal pretext, for rebellion. The exiled sons of the Minamoto, now grown men, answered the call. From his exile in Izu, the cold, patient, and politically brilliant Minamoto, no Yoritomo, began to consolidate his power, rallying the warriors of the eastern provinces to his banner. He established a headquarters in the small coastal village of Kamakura, far from the intrigues of Kyoto, creating a de facto military capital. The great 5-year conflict, known as the Genpei War, had begun. This was not a war of massive, faceless armies, but a deeply personal, nationwide family feud. The fighting was savage, and the momentum swung back and forth. The Taira, controlling the emperor and the capital, initially held the advantage. But their warriors had grown soft from years of court life, while the Minamoto were hardened by their time in the provinces. The true genius of the Minamoto cause was Yoritomo's younger half-brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune was everything his brother, Yoritomo, was not. A daring, impulsive, and almost supernaturally gifted battlefield commander. He seemed to move like a whirlwind, his tactics audacious and unpredictable. At the Battle of Ichi-no-Tani, he led a small detachment of cavalry down a supposedly impassable cliff face to smash into the rear of the Taira camp, causing a panic that led to a total rout. Yoshitsune's brilliant victories pushed the Taira out of the capital and steadily drove them westward. The final tragic act of the war took place not on land, but at sea. In 1185, the remaining Taira forces, their fleet crowded with the women and children of their clan, faced the Minamoto fleet in the Shimonoseki Strait at a place called Dan-no-Ura. On the main Taira ship was the 7-year-old Emperor Antoku, his grandmother Ladini, and the 3 sacred treasures of Japan, the mirror, the jewel, and the sacred sword, Kusanagi no Tsurugi, which legitimized imperial rule. At first, the battle favored the Taira, who were more experienced sailors. But the tide turned, and the Minamoto gained the upper hand. Seeing that all was lost, the Taira nobles began to commit ritual suicide, leaping into the waves to avoid the shame of capture. Lady Ni, holding her grandson, the boy emperor, in her arms, told him she was taking him to a new capital beneath the waves. She then plunged into the sea, and both of them were lost to the currents. In the chaos, the sacred sword Kusanagi went with them, its immense symbolic power seemingly lost to the depths forever. The historical mystery of this event lingers to this day. The sacred sword is a cornerstone of imperial legitimacy, and yet the historical chronicles are clear that it was lost at Dan-no-Ura. A sword, however, is still presented as part of the imperial regalia in modern enthronement ceremonies. Is it a replica made to replace the lost original? Was the sword that sank with the emperor itself a replica, with the true blade always hidden safely elsewhere? Or was the original somehow recovered from the seafloor? The imperial household agency maintains a strict silence on the nature of the treasures, leaving the fate of Kusanagi shrouded in a legend born from that terrible day. With the death of the emperor and the utter destruction of their clan, the Taira were erased as a political force. The 5-year struggle was over. The Minamoto were the undisputed masters of Japan. The refined aristocratic world of the Heian court had been shattered by the very warriors it had created, and the way was now clear for a new kind of government, one founded not on poetry and imperial decrees, but on the hard, sharp reality of the sword. With the Taira clan scattered to the winds and drowned beneath the waves of Dan-no-Ura, the Minamoto stood as the sole military power in Japan. The war was won, but the subsequent peace would be forged with a cold and calculating political ruthlessness that was, in its own way, as brutal as any battle. The architect of this new order was Minamoto no Yoritomo, while his younger brother, the brilliant Yoshitsune, had been the star of the battlefield. Yoritomo had remained in his eastern headquarters at Kamakura, playing a much longer and more important game. He was not building an army to win a war. He was building one to rule a country. And in this new country, there was no room for a hero as popular and charismatic as his younger brother. The relationship between the two brothers soured almost immediately after the victory. Yoshitsune, a warrior and not a politician, accepted a court title from the cloistered emperor Go Shirakawa without his brother's permission. To Yoritomo, This was an act of insubordination, a sign that Yoshitsune might be building his own power base in Kyoto, a potential rival. Yoritomo's paranoia, perhaps justified in a world built on betrayal, grew into a consuming obsession. He declared his heroic brother an outlaw and a traitor to the clan. The man who had won the Genpei War was now a fugitive, hunted across the very land he had helped conquer. The tragic story of Yoshitsune's flight, accompanied by his loyal retainer Benkei, would become one of Japan's most beloved and sorrowful legends. After years on the run, he was finally cornered and betrayed in the north, forced to take his own life. Yoritomo's message was brutally clear. Personal loyalty to him, the head of the clan, superseded any glory won on the battlefield or any honor bestowed by the court. The foundation of his new government would be absolute, unquestioning obedience. Yoritomo had no intention of repeating the Taira's mistake of moving to Kyoto and becoming entangled in the web of courtly intrigue. He understood that the rarefied atmosphere of the capital softened warriors and dulled their senses. He kept his headquarters in Kamakura, far to the east, establishing a separate, parallel government run by and for the Bushi. This new administration was known as the Bakufu, a term that literally means tent government, evoking the image of a commander's field headquarters. It was a government born of the battlefield, and it operated with military efficiency. Yoritomo established 3 central organs of power: the samurai dokoro, or board of retainers, to supervise his vassals and enforce discipline; the komonjo, or administrative board, to handle the government's finances and documents; and the monchujo, or board of inquiry, to serve as a court of law, settling the endless disputes over land rights and inheritances that were the lifeblood of provincial politics. All the while, Yoritomo was careful not to abolish the imperial court. He knew that the emperor, as a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, was the ultimate source of all legitimacy. To usurp the throne would have been unthinkable and would have turned every clan against him. Instead, he allowed the emperor and the Heian aristocracy to continue their poetic, ceremonial existence in Kyoto, but he systematically stripped them of any real political power. It was a brilliant political solution, creating a dual system of government that would last for nearly 700 years. The emperor reigned, but the warriors ruled. Finally, in 1192, after years of consolidating his power, the court in Kyoto bestowed upon Yoritomo the title he had long coveted, Sei Daishogun, the great barbarian subduing generalissimo. This title, as we have seen, was an old one, a temporary military commission granted for specific campaigns. Yoritomo transformed it. He made it a permanent, hereditary position, effectively making him the military dictator of all Japan. The era of the Kamakura Shogunate had officially begun. The historical debate surrounding Yoritomo centers on his intentions. Was the creation of the Bakufu the result of a long-held, visionary plan to create a new form of government, or was it a series of pragmatic, improvised steps taken to secure his power after the war? Some historians see him as a revolutionary genius who conceived of a warrior-led state from the beginning. Others portray him as a more cautious, reactive politician who, fearing the fate of the Taira, simply wanted to keep his warriors away from the corrupting influence of Kyoto, with the formal structures of the shogunate developing organically out of that initial decision. The truth is likely somewhere in between. Yoritomo was a master of responding to circumstances, but his every move was guided by a consistent, overarching principle: the concentration of all practical power in his own hands and the hands of his retainers in Kamakura. To extend his authority across the country, he appointed his most trusted vassals to two new nationwide posts. The first was Shugo, or military governor. A Shugo was appointed to each province, responsible for maintaining law and order, suppressing rebellions, and commanding the local bushi in times of war. The second post was Jito, or land steward. Jito were appointed to individual estates, both public lands and private Shuin, with the authority to collect taxes and manage the land. This was his masterstroke. By placing his own men as governors and tax collectors throughout Japan, he created a network of direct control that bypassed the old court-appointed officials entirely. Power no longer flowed from Kyoto, it flowed from Kamakura. The age of the samurai, as mere servants, had ended. They were now the masters. The government forged by Minamoto no Yoritomo was a testament to his political genius, a stable and efficient system designed to last for generations. The Minamoto clan itself, however, was not. Yoritomo's direct line proved to be tragically short-lived. After his death in 1199, his two sons, who succeeded him as shogun, were weak, ineffective, and quickly assassinated. The Minamoto bloodline was extinguished, leaving a dangerous power vacuum at the very top of the warrior government. Yet the Bakufu did not collapse. Instead, power was swiftly and skillfully consolidated by a clan that had been operating in the shadows all along. The Hojo, the family of Yoritomo's own formidable wife, Masako. Through cunning political maneuvering, the Hojo clan took control, establishing the new office of Shikin, or Shogun's Regent. This created a truly remarkable and uniquely Japanese political structure, a matryoshka doll of puppet rulers. In Kyoto, the emperor reigned as a divine figurehead, bestowing legitimacy but wielding no actual power. In Kamakura, the shogun, often a young boy brought in from a noble Kyoto family, held the title of military ruler, but was himself a powerless puppet. The real authority rested in the hands of the Hojo regent, who commanded the armies and administered the country. This system, with its layers of symbolic and actual power, proved to be remarkably stable. And for nearly a century, the Hojo regents provided strong, decisive leadership. It was this leadership that would soon face the greatest foreign threat in Japan's history. Across the sea, the world was being remade. In the early 13th century, the Mongol hordes under Genghis Khan had erupted from the steppes of Central Asia, forging the largest contiguous land empire in human history. By the 1260s, his grandson, the great Khan Kublai, had completed the conquest of China, establishing the Yuan dynasty. He was the most powerful man on the planet, his empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. And from his new capital, in what is now Beijing, he cast his gaze eastward, toward the small, defiant island nation that had never bent its knee to a foreign power. In 1266, the Khan's envoys arrived in Japan, carrying a letter to its king. The message was polite but unambiguous. Submit to the great Khan, become a tributary state of his glorious empire, or face the consequences. The imperial court in Kyoto was terrified and inclined to appease the Khan. But the decision rested with the Bakufu in Kamakura, and the Hojo regent at the time, a young and resolute man named Tokimune, made a fateful choice. He sent the envoys away with no answer. A calculated and deeply insulting act of defiance. Kublai Khan, unaccustomed to being ignored, prepared his revenge. In 1274, a massive invasion fleet, a combined force of some 900 ships and nearly 40,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers, set sail for Japan. The armada landed at Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu. The samurai who gathered to defend their homeland were about to receive a brutal education in a new way of war. The Japanese bushi were accustomed to a highly ritualized form of combat. A battle would often begin with warriors from either side riding forward to announce their lineage and deeds, seeking out a worthy opponent for a one-on-one duel of mounted archery. The Mongols had no time for such niceties. They fought as a disciplined, unified force, advancing in tight formations under the sound of war drums. They used coordinated volleys of poison-tipped arrows and wielded short, powerful composite bows that outranged the Japanese yumi. Most terrifying of all were their new projectile weapons, ceramic shells filled with gunpowder that exploded with a deafening roar, panicking the samurai's horses and sowing confusion in their ranks. The samurai fought with incredible bravery, but they were outmatched and pushed back. As night fell, the Mongol forces, having inflicted heavy casualties, withdrew to their ships, intending to resume their relentless advance the next morning. They would never get the chance. During the night, the weather turned. A ferocious storm, a typhoon of terrifying power, descended upon the bay. The wind and waves smashed the Mongol ships against the shore and against each other, sinking hundreds of vessels and drowning thousands of soldiers. The battered remnants of the invasion fleet were forced to limp back to the mainland in defeat. The Japanese believed their gods, the kami, had intervened to protect them. They called the storm a kamikaze, a divine wind. Hojo, Tokimun, and the Bakufu knew, however, that this was only a temporary reprieve. They spent the next 7 years in a frantic state of national preparation. A massive stone wall, over 12 miles long, was constructed along the coast of Hakata Bay to deny the invaders an easy landing. The samurai of Western Japan were placed on permanent alert, and the entire country's resources were mobilized for the coming war. In 1281, the Mongols returned. This time it was an even more terrifying force, a two-pronged armada from both China and Korea, totaling over 4,000 ships and perhaps 140,000 men. Arguably, the largest seaborne invasion force in history, until the Normandy landings of World War II. For weeks, the samurai defenders, using the new coastal wall as their primary defense, managed to hold the invaders at bay. The smaller, more maneuverable Japanese boats would dart out to attack the larger Mongol vessels, allowing the samurai to board and engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat. A bloody stalemate ensued. Then, on August 15th, the heavens unleashed their fury once more. A second, even more powerful typhoon struck the Mongol fleet. For 2 days the storm raged, annihilating what was left of the Khan's grand armada. The second kamikaze sealed Japan's independence and cemented the legend of a divinely protected land. While the typhoons were undeniably the decisive factor, recent archaeological finds of the sunken fleet suggest the Mongols had their own problems. Many of the ships were flat-bottomed river junks, hastily constructed and unsuited for open ocean warfare, making them especially vulnerable to the storms. The victory, therefore, was likely a combination of samurai valor, Mongol logistical failures, and the awesome, timely power of nature. But this great victory which should have secured the shogunate's glory, would instead plant the seeds of its destruction. The divine winds that scattered the Mongol fleets had saved Japan from foreign conquest. But in a strange and tragic irony, this great military triumph would lead directly to the downfall of the government that had orchestrated it. The victory, which should have been the crowning achievement of the Kamakura Shogunate, instead exposed a fatal flaw in its system. The entire structure of samurai society was built upon a transactional relationship of loyalty for reward. A warrior pledged his life and service to a lord, and in return for his valor in battle, he expected to be rewarded with spoils, typically land and titles seized from the defeated enemy. But the Mongol invasions were a purely defensive war. There was no conquered territory to distribute, no enemy estates to confiscate. The Bakufu had called upon thousands of its vassals, many of whom had bankrupted themselves outfitting their retinues and maintaining the coastal defenses for years. And now it had nothing to give them. This created a crisis of faith in the shogunate. The samurai, especially those in the western provinces who had borne the brunt of the fighting, grew deeply resentful. The sacred bond of loyalty that had held the warrior class together for over a century began to fracture. At the same time, the Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines that had offered up ceaseless prayers for victory also claimed credit for summoning the kamikaze and demanded payment, further straining the government's depleted coffers. The Hojo regents, once seen as decisive and powerful leaders, now appeared weak and insolvent. The foundations of the Kamakura Bakufu were cracking, and for the first time in a long while, ambitious men began to dream of a different order. One of these men was the emperor himself, Go-Daigo. Unlike the passive ceremonial emperors of the preceding centuries, Go-Daigo was a throwback, a fiercely intelligent and deeply ambitious ruler who believed passionately in the ancient ideal of direct imperial rule. He saw the shogunate's financial weakness and the growing discontent among the samurai as a once-in-a-century opportunity to overthrow the warriors in Kamakura and restore power to the throne in Kyoto. He began to secretly gather allies among disaffected bushi and powerful monasteries, plotting the downfall of the Hojo. His initial attempts at rebellion failed, and the Bakufu exiled him to a remote island, but the spirit of his imperial restoration movement had been unleashed. To crush the last embers of the emperor's loyalist forces, the Kamakura Shogunate dispatched its most powerful and respected general, a man named Ashikaga Shogunate. He was the head of a branch family of the Minamoto clan, a man of impeccable warrior lineage and immense personal charisma. But Takauji was also a shrewd political operator who could see that the Hojo's time was running out. In a shocking and decisive act of betrayal that would alter the course of history, Ashikaga Takauji, the man sent to destroy the imperial cause, instead declared his support for it. He turned his army around and marched on the shogunate's headquarters in Kyoto, seizing it in the name of the emperor. At the same time, another powerful eastern general, Nita Yoshisada, laid siege to the city of Kamakura itself. The fighting was intense, but the shogunate's support had evaporated. In 1333, the city fell. In a final grim display of samurai honor, the last Hojo regent, along with over 800 of his loyal retainers, retreated to a temple and committed mass suicide, putting an end to their clan and to the 140-year reign of the Kamakura Shogunate. Emperor Go-Daigo returned from exile in triumph. The warrior government was destroyed, and his dream of an imperial restoration, the Kenmu Restoration, was now a reality. It would last for 3 short, chaotic years. Go-Daigo, a man who understood ancient ideals better than contemporary politics, made a catastrophic miscalculation. He sought to rebuild the old Heian-era civilian aristocracy, rewarding his court nobles with land and key government posts, while largely ignoring the samurai who had actually won him his victory. Ashikaga Takauji, the man most responsible for his success, was given high honors but little real power. The entire warrior class felt betrayed and alienated. Takauji, recognizing that the emperor's government had no future, betrayed his new master just as he had his old one. Now championing the cause of the slighted samurai, he drove Go-Daigo from Kyoto. In a move of political genius, he found a pliable prince from a rival branch of the imperial family and installed him on the throne, creating a new northern court in Kyoto that would do his bidding. Go-Daigo, refusing to surrender his legitimacy, fled south to the remote mountains of Yoshino, where he established a rival southern court. For the next 60 years, Japan would be torn apart by a conflict between these two imperial courts, a period known as the Nanbokucho. In 1338, the new northern emperor, grateful to the man who had placed him on the throne, granted Ashikaga Takauji the title of shogun. A new warrior dynasty, the Ashikaga Shogunate, had risen from the ashes of Kamakura. The legacy of its founder, however, remains one of the great debates of Japanese history. Was Takauji a self-serving traitor who callously used and discarded both shogun and emperor to achieve his own ambitions? Or was he a more tragic figure, a man who genuinely tried to serve the imperial cause but was forced into rebellion by Go-Daigo's political incompetence? The great war epic of the era, the Taiheki, portrays him as a deeply conflicted man, capable of both great compassion and great cruelty, forever torn between his duties and his desires. Whatever his motives, his actions plunged Japan into a new and even more chaotic era of warfare. The new Ashikaga Shogunate, born from a complex web of betrayal and shifting loyalties, was a fundamentally different creature from its predecessor. While the Kamakura Bakufu had wisely kept its headquarters in the provinces, maintaining its rugged warrior identity, the Ashikaga shoguns made a fateful decision. They moved their government to Kyoto. They established their base in the city's Muromachi district, and over time, they were seduced by the very courtly culture their ancestors had overthrown. The Ashikaga shoguns became great patrons of the arts, overseeing a cultural renaissance that would profoundly shape the Japanese aesthetic. It was under their patronage that the stark beauty of Zen Buddhist rock gardens, the restrained elegance of the tea ceremony, and the mysterious minimalist drama of No theater flourished. The third Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimitsu, even built the breathtaking Golden Pavilion, a villa covered in gold leaf that perfectly symbolized the shogunate's embrace of aristocratic luxury. But as the shoguns became more absorbed in these refined cultural pursuits, they grew increasingly distant from the provincial warriors who were the true source of their power. The Ashikaga shogunate was never able to achieve the same degree of centralized control as Kamakura. Its authority was built on a fragile network of alliances with powerful provincial governors, the shugo. Over time, these shugo evolved into something new and more powerful, the Shugo Daimyo. They were regional warlords, ruling their provinces as personal fiefdoms, often raising their own armies and conducting their own foreign policy while paying only nominal respect to the shogun in Kyoto. The shogun became less of a military dictator and more of a first among equals, a prestigious but often powerless mediator in the squabbles of his supposedly subordinate vassals. The political foundation of the country was becoming a patchwork quilt of semi-independent domains, and the threads holding it all together were beginning to fray. By the mid-15th century, the authority of the shogunate had decayed almost completely. The reigning shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, was a man who perfectly embodied this decline. A connoisseur of the arts, he was a hopelessly inept politician who simply wished to be left alone to pursue his aesthetic passions, eventually building the serene silver pavilion as his retreat. It was in this vacuum of leadership that a simple family squabble escalated into a national catastrophe. Yoshimasa, having no heir, had designated his younger brother as his successor. Then, in a turn of events worthy of a drama, his wife gave birth to a son, creating an instant succession crisis. Two factions immediately formed at court, one supporting the shogun's brother, the other his infant son. Ordinarily, this might have been resolved through political maneuvering. But the dispute became the pretext for a much larger and more dangerous conflict. Two of the most powerful and rivalrous Shugo Daimyo families, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, each decided to champion one of the claimants to the succession. Their long-simmering feud, fueled by decades of competition for influence at court, now had a cause to rally behind. In 1467, both clans, ignoring the shogun's pleas for peace, summoned their vast samurai armies, tens of thousands of warriors from the provinces. Their chosen battlefield was the capital of Japan itself. The Onin War had begun. What followed was a decade of unimaginable horror. The war was not a series of grand, decisive battles, but a brutal, grinding, and utterly pointless urban conflict that transformed the magnificent city of Kyoto into a smoldering ruin. The great armies dug trenches, built fortifications, and engaged in savage street-to-street fighting. Alliances shifted constantly as lords betrayed one another for momentary advantage. Priceless temples that had stood for centuries were burned to the ground for firewood. Palaces were looted, and entire sections of the city were reduced to what came to be known as the Red Earth of Kyoto. The civilian population fled in terror, and the sophisticated court culture that had defined the age was shattered. After 10 long years of this senseless destruction, the war simply stopped. It didn't end with a peace treaty or a climactic victory. The original succession dispute had long since been forgotten, and the main protagonists had died. The rival clans, their resources exhausted and their armies weary, simply disengaged and marched back to their home provinces in 1477. The question of when the Onin War truly ended is a historical mystery. The year 1477 marks the cessation of fighting in the capital, but there was no resolution. The conflict had merely broken apart and spread, like a metastasizing cancer, into the provinces. The war's true legacy was the complete and utter collapse of central authority. The Ashikaga Shogunate was now a hollow shell, its decrees ignored, its power extending no further than the burned-out grounds of the shogun's palace. The great Shugo Daimyo families, who had instigated the war, were financially and militarily crippled. This created a nationwide power vacuum and unleashed a new, terrifying social phenomenon that would define the next century. Gekkokujo, a phrase that means the low, overthrowing the high. Across Japan, ambitious local warriors, clan deputies, and even armed peasants, seeing the weakness of their traditional masters, rose up to seize power for themselves. The old order was swept away in a tide of violence and betrayal. The Onin War had been the starting gun for a new and even bloodier period in Japanese history, the Age of Warring States. The Onin War had thrown a lit match into the tinderbox of provincial Japan. The decade of conflict that hollowed out Kyoto and shattered the shogun's authority unleashed a century of unrelenting nationwide civil war. This was the Sengoku Jidai, the age of the country at war. For over 100 years, from the end of the Onin War until the dawn of the 17th century, Japan ceased to exist as a unified nation. It became a chaotic mosaic of hundreds of independent domains, each ruled by a warlord whose only law was the strength of his army and whose only goal was survival and conquest. The emperor in Kyoto was a forgotten, impoverished figure, and the shogun was a powerless puppet. This was the age of Gekkokujo, the low overthrowing the high, where a man's lineage mattered less than his raw ambition and his capacity for violence. A new breed of ruler emerged from this crucible of chaos, the Sengoku Daimyo. They were a world apart from the old, aristocratic Shugo Daimyo they had supplanted. Their claim to power came not from an imperial title or an appointment by the shogun, but from their own military might, their jitsuryoku. Many were quintessential examples of the new social mobility. Men of obscure origins who had betrayed and overthrown their former masters. They were intensely pragmatic and ruthless innovators, not just in warfare, but in governance. A daimyo understood that military strength depended on economic strength. They worked to expand agriculture, promote commerce, and rationalize tax collection within their domains, creating laws and administrative structures that were loyal only to them. Each domain became a small, self-contained, and highly militarized state, constantly testing the defenses of its neighbors. This new political reality brought about a revolution in the way wars were fought. The classic battlefield image of the Heian and Kamakura periods, with its focus on individual duels between elite, mounted samurai archers, was now hopelessly obsolete. Warfare in the Sengoku period was a game of numbers and discipline. The new daimyo raised massive armies, the bulk of which were not samurai, but ashigaru, or light-footed soldiers. These were infantrymen, often conscripted from the peasantry, who could be trained quickly and armed cheaply. Their primary weapon was the long pike, or yari, and they were taught to fight in dense formations. A wall of disciplined pikemen proved to be a brutally effective countermeasure to the traditional cavalry charge, fundamentally diminishing the role of the mounted samurai. The samurai themselves had to adapt to this new reality. They were still the elite corps and the commanders of the army, but they increasingly fought on foot, leading units of ashigaru into battle. The landscape itself was transformed by this new era of warfare. The simple mountain forts of the past gave way to a new and more sophisticated form of castle. These were massive, complex structures designed to withstand prolonged sieges. They were built with towering stone foundations, or ishigaki, intricate and confusing gate systems, and a multi-storied central tower, the tenshu, which served as the command center and the ultimate symbol of the daimyo's power. These castles became the administrative and economic centers of their domains, fortress cities that projected power for miles around. But the single most transformative innovation of this violent age arrived on the currents of the sea. In 1543, a Chinese junk carrying Portuguese traders was blown off course and landed on the small southern island of Tanegashima. These were the first Europeans the Japanese had ever seen, and they brought with them a piece of technology that would change the face of samurai warfare forever. The arquebus, a simple, portable matchlock firearm. The local daimyo was fascinated by these fire lances and immediately purchased 2 of them, ordering his swordsmiths to reverse engineer the technology. The Japanese, long masters of metalworking, proved to be brilliant and rapid innovators. Within a decade, they were mass-producing firearms of a higher quality than the European originals, and the new weapon began to spread like wildfire across the warring domains. The introduction of the arquebus was more than a military innovation. It was a social one. It challenged the very foundation of the samurai's martial dominance. A lifetime of training, the mastery of the sword and bow, the unwritten code of the warrior. All of it could be negated in an instant by a lead ball fired by a peasant Ashigaru with only a few weeks of training. Some traditionalists scorned the firearm as a coward's weapon, but the more pragmatic daimyo immediately grasped its potential. It democratized the battlefield, allowing a lord to field a lethal fighting force quickly and cheaply. While it is a common myth that only samurai could own weapons, the Sengoku period was a time when these lines were incredibly blurred. Many villages maintained their own armed militias, and part-time peasant warriors, known as jisamurai, were common. The proliferation of the arquebus now put immense destructive power into the hands of a much wider segment of the population. The nature of war had irrevocably shifted from a clash of heroes to a calculus of firepower and attrition. The chaos of the Sengoku Jidai had reached a fever pitch, but this very chaos, fueled by new technologies and a new breed of ruthless leaders, was setting the stage for the final bloody act. The unification of a nation that had forgotten the meaning of the word. For a century, the cauldron of the Sengoku Jidai had boiled with the ambitions of countless warlords, a chaotic and bloody free-for-all with no end in sight. But the relentless attrition of this era, like a brutal form of natural selection, had begun to favor the strongest, the most innovative, and the most ruthless. By the middle of the 16th century, a handful of exceptionally powerful daimyo had consolidated vast domains and now vied for ultimate supremacy. Out of this brutal competition, one man would emerge with the vision, the ambition, and the sheer audacity to attempt what had become unthinkable: the complete unification of Japan under a single sword. His name was Oda Nobunaga, and he would begin the final violent chapter of the Age of Warring States. Nobunaga was not born to one of the great ancient clans. He was the son of a minor, upstart warlord from the small province of Owari. In his youth, he was known as the Fool of Owari for his outrageous and erratic behavior. He would wander the streets in bizarre, mismatched clothing, openly flouting the strict social etiquette expected of a young samurai lord. But this eccentric exterior concealed a mind that was razor-sharp, unconventional, and utterly contemptuous of tradition. Nobunaga was a pragmatist to his core. He had no patience for the old ways of the samurai, for the authority of the shogun. or for the sacred pronouncements of the Buddhist temples. He saw them all as obstacles to be swept aside in his quest for power. He was a figure of stark contradictions, a military genius who embraced new technologies, an economic visionary who understood the power of free trade, and a tyrant capable of appalling cruelty. His dramatic arrival on the national stage came in 1560 at the Battle of Okayazama. The powerful daimyo Imagawa Yoshimoto was marching on Kyoto with a massive army of some 25,000 men, intending to crush the minor Oda clan along the way. Nobunaga could field barely 3,000 soldiers to oppose him. Trapped and facing certain annihilation, he made a decision of breathtaking audacity. As a torrential thunderstorm descended, providing cover for his movements, Nobunaga led his small force in a daring surprise attack directly on the Imagawa main camp. In the chaos of the storm, his men crashed into the unprepared enemy, and in the ensuing melee, Imagawa Yoshimoto himself was slain. The massive Imagawa army, its leader dead, simply dissolved. Against impossible odds, Nobunaga had not just survived, he had triumphed, and his name was now spoken with a new mixture of awe and fear across Japan. Nobunaga's genius lay in his ability to see the future of warfare. While others were still debating the merits of firearms, he embraced them with total conviction. He understood that the arquebus was not just a new weapon, but a force that could overturn the entire social and military order. He equipped a larger percentage of his army with firearms than any of his contemporaries, and more importantly, he developed tactics to maximize their devastating potential. His masterpiece of military innovation came in 1575 at the Battle of Nagashino. Here he faced the fearsome army of the Takeda clan, whose cavalry, the most famous and powerful samurai horsemen in all of Japan, were considered invincible. Nobunaga's army was a motley collection of samurai and peasant ashigaru. To counter the Takeda charge, he constructed simple wooden palisades along a riverbank and placed his 3,000 arquebusiers behind them. He then arranged his gunners into 3 rotating ranks. The first rank would fire, then kneel to reload, while the second rank fired, who would then kneel as the third rank fired, by which time the first rank was ready to fire again. As the Takeda cavalry charged forward in a glorious thundering wave, they were met not with a single volley, but with a continuous, rolling storm of lead that tore through their ranks. The pride of the Takeda clan was annihilated, their invincible cavalry charge broken and bleeding in the mud. Nagashino was a watershed moment in Japanese history. It signaled the definitive end of the traditional samurai fighting style and the beginning of a new, more modern form of warfare based on disciplined infantry and massed firepower. With his military power growing, Nobunaga adopted a personal seal that declared his ultimate ambition, Tenka Fubu. While the exact meaning is debated by historians, it is often translated as all the world under one sword, or rule the realm by military force. It was a clear statement of his intention to end the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai. In 1568, he marched into Kyoto, installing a puppet shogun and making himself the effective ruler of central Japan. But his path to unification was paved with blood. He was utterly merciless toward his enemies, particularly the powerful and militant Buddhist monasteries, which he viewed as rivals to his authority. In 1571, he surrounded the ancient and sacred monastery complex on Mount Hiei, a center of Japanese Buddhism, for nearly a millennium. Accusing the monks of sedition, he ordered his army to ascend the mountain and show no mercy. They burned the vast complex to the ground and systematically slaughtered an estimated 20,000 men, women, and children. The act earned him the enduring nickname of the Demon King and revealed the terrifying depths of his resolve. By 1582, Oda Nobunaga had conquered nearly a third of Japan and was poised to become the undisputed master of the entire nation. The Fool of Owari was on the verge of achieving the impossible. By the early summer of 1582, Oda Nobunaga was the undisputed master of central Japan, standing on the precipice of total victory. His armies were poised to crush the last remaining independent daimyo clans in the west. The long, bloody century of the Sengoku Jidai was drawing to a close, and Nobunaga was its architect. But history, in its infinite capacity for irony, had one last, shocking betrayal in store. While pausing in Kyoto at a temple called Honnoji, accompanied by only a small retinue of guards and pages, Nobunaga was awakened in the pre-dawn hours by the sounds of chaos. An army was storming the temple grounds, believing it to be a minor brawl. He soon realized the terrifying truth. The banners surrounding the temple were those of his own most trusted general, Akechi Mitsuhide. The motivation for Mitsuhide's betrayal remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Japanese history. Was he driven by a personal grudge after a public insult from the notoriously abrasive Nobunaga? Was it a calculated bid for his own power? Or was he a traditionalist at heart, horrified by the Demon King's contempt for the old institutions of the court and the temples? We will likely never know. Trapped and hopelessly outnumbered, Nobunaga fought with a spear alongside his young attendant, Mori Ranmaru. But the outcome was never in doubt. Wounded and facing certain capture, Oda Nobunaga retreated into the blazing inferno of the temple and committed seppuku, his death as fiery and dramatic as his life. He was 47 years old, and the unification of Japan was left unfinished. The news of Nobunaga's assassination sent shockwaves through the country, creating a sudden power vacuum. The man who would fill this void and ultimately complete Nobunaga's quest was perhaps the most remarkable individual in all of Japanese history. His name was Hashiba Hideyoshi, though the world would come to know him as Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He was everything Nobunaga was not. Born a peasant, the son of a lowly ashigaru, Hideyoshi began his career in Nobunaga's service as a menial servant, reputedly his sandal-bearer. He was described as small, thin, and strikingly ugly, with a face like a monkey, a nickname he carried throughout his life. But what he lacked in physical stature and noble birth, he more than made up for with a brilliant mind, an almost supernatural talent for logistics, and a profound understanding of human psychology. Where Nobunaga ruled through fear and brute force, Hideyoshi ruled through charm, cleverness, and negotiation. At the time of the Honnoji incident, Hideyoshi was far to the west, laying siege to the Mori clan's Takamatsu castle. When the news of his master's death reached him, he acted with breathtaking speed and decisiveness. He kept the information a secret from his Mori opponents and immediately negotiated a swift peace, then turned his entire army around and began a legendary force march back towards Kyoto. Covering a distance that should have taken weeks in just a matter of days, this famous Chugoku return caught the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide completely by surprise. Just 13 days after Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi confronted and crushed Mitsuhide's army at the Battle of Yamazaki. By so publicly and swiftly avenging his lord, Hideyoshi positioned himself as Nobunaga's true and rightful successor. He then spent the next several years skillfully outmaneuvering Nobunaga's surviving sons and other senior generals, consolidating his claim to power through a masterful combination of military pressure and political alliance building. With his authority secure, Hideyoshi set out to finish what Nobunaga had started. He continued the campaign of unification, but his methods were different. He preferred to win by intimidation and diplomacy rather than outright slaughter. He would amass an overwhelmingly massive army, sometimes numbering over 200,000 men, and simply surround his opponent, inviting them to surrender in the face of impossible odds. This strategy proved incredibly effective. He subdued the great clans of the islands of Shikoku and Kyushu, and in 1590 he laid siege to the last major holdout, the powerful Hojo clan, at their impenetrable fortress of Odawara. After a 6-month siege, the Hojo surrendered. With their defeat, the Sengoku Jidai was finally over. After more than a century of constant warfare, Japan was once again united under a single ruler. Because of his peasant birth, Hideyoshi could never be granted the title of shogun. Instead, he had the court grant him the highest aristocratic titles of Imperial Regent, Kampaku, and Grand Minister of State, Daijo Daijin, ruling from a magnificent new castle he built in Osaka. Now the undisputed master of Japan, he enacted a series of revolutionary reforms designed to prevent the country from ever sliding back into chaos. His most significant act was the Great Sword Hunt of 1588. He issued an edict that prohibited anyone who was not of the samurai class from owning swords or other weapons. This monumental decree disarmed the entire populace, ending the era of armed peasants and warrior monks, and formally cementing the samurai as a distinct and separate warrior class with a legal monopoly on the instruments of the violence. At the same time, he initiated a nationwide land survey, the Taiko Kenchi, which systematically measured and assessed the value of every plot of agricultural land. This regularized the tax system and tied the peasants firmly to their fields. Together, these reforms effectively froze the social structure of Japan, ending the chaotic social mobility of the warring states period and creating a rigid, hereditary 4-class system, samurai at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants, that would last for nearly 3 centuries. The peasant's son had not only unified the realm, he had remade its very society. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant who had become the absolute ruler of Japan, had achieved the impossible. He had ended a century of civil war, disarmed the populace, and imposed a new and rigid social order upon the land. But peace brought with it a dangerous and unfamiliar problem. What to do with the hundreds of thousands of samurai who had been bred for nothing but war? These vast armies, led by powerful and ambitious daimyo, were now idle, a restless and potentially explosive force. Hideyoshi, the master strategist, knew that he needed to direct their energies outward, lest they turn inward and shatter the fragile peace he had so carefully constructed. A foreign adventure was not just an option. It was a political necessity. In his later years, Hideyoshi's ambition, once a tool for unifying Japan, had swelled into a full-blown megalomania. Having conquered one nation, he now set his sights on an empire. He dreamed of conquering Ming China, and from there, perhaps even the distant lands of the Philippines and India. It was a fantasy of breathtaking arrogance, but it also served a very practical purpose. By launching a massive foreign war, he could keep his powerful daimyo occupied, drain their treasuries, and reward them with new lands on the continent, all while cementing his own legacy as one of history's great conquerors. The path to China, however, lay directly through the Korean peninsula. Hideyoshi sent envoys to the Joseon dynasty of Korea, demanding that they grant his armies free passage and join him as the vanguard of his glorious invasion. The Korean court, which was a loyal and long-standing tributary state of Ming China, was horrified by the demand and flatly refused. This refusal was all the pretext Hideyoshi needed. In 1592, he unleashed the full fury of unified Japan upon Korea. A massive invasion force of over 150,000 battle-hardened samurai, veterans of the Sengoku Jidai, and armed with the most advanced firearms in Asia, stormed ashore at the port of Busan. The initial invasion was a terrifying success. The Korean army, long accustomed to peace, was unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the Japanese assault. The samurai, led by commanders like the Christian daimyo Konishi Yukinaga, swept up the peninsula with shocking speed. They captured the capital, Seoul, in less than 3 weeks and continued their relentless drive north, seizing Pyongyang. The Korean king fled, and it seemed as though the entire country would be overrun in a matter of months. But the Japanese had made a critical miscalculation. They had assumed that controlling the land was the same as controlling the sea. Their long, tenuous supply line, which stretched across the strait from Japan, was their Achilles heel. And it was here that Korea's greatest hero emerged, Admiral Yi Sun-sin. Admiral Yi was a naval commander of pure genius. He had developed a new and revolutionary type of warship, the famous turtle ship, or Geobukseon. These were arguably the world's first ironclad vessels, their curved tops covered in iron plates to deflect cannonballs and arrows. They were propelled by oars for maneuverability, armed with cannons on all sides, and featured a fearsome iron dragon's head at the prow from which they could spew fire and smoke. In a series of brilliant naval engagements, Admiral Yi's small fleet of turtle ships and other warships repeatedly ambushed and annihilated the much larger but more conventional Japanese fleets. He severed Hideyoshi's supply lines, leaving the massive samurai armies deep inside Korea, isolated, undersupplied, and starving. At the same time, the invasion ignited a fierce resistance among the Korean people. Civilian militias, the Uibyong, rose up across the country, waging a brutal guerrilla war against the Japanese occupiers. They harassed supply convoys, assassinated collaborators, and tied down thousands of samurai in a frustrating and unwinnable counterinsurgency. Finally, the Ming Chinese emperor, realizing the threat to his own borders, sent a massive army into Korea. The combined Chinese and Korean forces began to push the Japanese back from the north, while Admiral Yi strangled them from the sea. The lightning invasion bogged down into a bloody and miserable war of attrition. After years of brutal fighting, a weary truce was negotiated. The peace talks ultimately failed, and in 1597, an enraged and increasingly unstable Hideyoshi launched a second invasion. This campaign was marked by a new level of savagery. Frustrated by the Korean resistance, Japanese commanders were ordered to take trophies from the slain. They collected the noses and ears of tens of thousands of Korean soldiers and civilians, packing them in barrels of brine to be sent back to Japan as proof of their martial success. A monument in Kyoto called the Mimizuka, or Mound of Ears, still stands today, a grim testament containing the severed body parts of at least 38,000 Koreans. This second invasion was as futile as the first. The war finally came to an abrupt and anticlimactic end, not on the battlefield, but in a castle in Japan. In the autumn of 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, his body and perhaps his mind, consumed by illness, died. His final command was a secret order for all his forces to withdraw from Korea. The disastrous 7-year war was over. It had achieved nothing but the devastation of Korea, the death of hundreds of thousands, and the complete exhaustion of Japan's own national treasury. Hideyoshi's grand imperial dream had died with him, and his failure in Korea would leave a power vacuum in Japan that would immediately be filled by one last patient and cunning player in the great game of unification. The death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in his opulent Osaka castle created the very power vacuum he had schemed his entire life to prevent. His only heir, Hideyori, was a 5-year-old boy, far too young to command the loyalty of the powerful and battle-hardened daimyo who had unified Japan under his father's banner. The disastrous and costly war in Korea had left the country exhausted and the samurai leadership deeply divided. Hideyoshi, in a desperate deathbed attempt to preserve his legacy, had created a council of 5 elders, a regency composed of the 5 most powerful lords in the realm, who were all made to swear a solemn oath to protect his son and rule collectively until the boy came of age. It was a government by committee, a fragile arrangement that depended entirely on the honor of men who had spent their lives mastering the art of betrayal. The peace would not last. 2 figures on the council quickly emerged as the leaders of 2 irreconcilable factions. The first was Ashida Mitsunari, a brilliant but famously abrasive administrator who had been Hideyoshi's most trusted bureaucratic aide. Mitsunari was fiercely loyal to the memory of his master and the cause of his young heir, Hideyori. He was a master of logistics and planning, but he was not a traditional warrior. His arrogance and his status as a pen pusher had earned him the enmity of many of the great military commanders. He became the de facto leader of the Western Army, a coalition of daimyo, primarily from the west of Japan, who remained loyal to the house of Toyotomi. His great rival was the most powerful, wealthy, and cunning man in the entire country, Tokugawa Ieyasu. The head of the Tokugawa clan, Ieyasu, was the lord of the vast Kanto region in the east, with his capital at the castle town of Edo, the future Tokyo. He was the ultimate survivor of the Sengoku Jidai, a man who had been a hostage in his youth and had carefully navigated alliances with both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, all while patiently building his own immense power base. He was known for his almost superhuman patience and his mastery of the long game. While the other lords were fighting in Korea, Ieyasu had kept his forces at home, consolidating his domain and preserving his strength. Now, with Hideyoshi gone, he saw his chance. Almost immediately, he began to flout the council's rules, arranging political marriages for his children and acting not as a regent, but as the new master of Japan. Ishida Mitsunari saw Ieyasu's ambition for what it was, a direct threat to Hideyori's inheritance, and began to rally the loyalist forces to oppose him. By the year 1600, the country was once again split into two massive armed camps, and a final decisive battle for the future of Japan was inevitable. The two armies, numbering close to 200,000 men in total, converged in the autumn of that year at a narrow, fog-shrouded crossroads in central Japan called Sekigahara. It was a place of immense strategic importance, and it would become the stage for the largest and most consequential battle in samurai history. Ishida Mitsunari, commanding the Western Army, arrived first and established a superb defensive position, his forces arranged on the hills surrounding the valley. When Ieyasu's Eastern Army marched into the valley on the morning of October 21st, they were marching into a trap. The battle began in the pouring rain and thick fog, the sounds of musket fire and the clash of steel echoing through the mist. For hours, the fighting was intense. The Western forces, using their superior terrain, held the advantage, pushing back Ieyasu's troops. The Eastern Army was on the verge of collapse, but Tokugawa Ieyasu, the master strategist, had not placed his faith in battlefield tactics alone. His greatest weapon was betrayal. For weeks, he had been secretly communicating with several of the Western Army daimyo, promising them land and titles if they would switch sides at a critical moment. The most important of these was a young lord named Kobayakawa Hideaki, whose 15,000 men held a key position on a hill overlooking the flank of the entire Western Army. For hours, Kobayakawa did nothing, watching as both sides bled each other wide. The battle hung in the balance, resting on the decision of this one man. The traditional story, a dramatic tale that may be a later embellishment, is that an enraged Ieyasu, tired of waiting, ordered his arquebusiers to fire a volley at Kobayakawa's position, a terrifying hint of what would happen if he did not honor their secret agreement. Whether it was this threat or a calculated decision that the Western cause was lost, Kobayakawa finally made his move. He ordered his men to charge, not against the Eastern Army below, but down the hill and directly into the side of their own allies. This single act of treachery caused the immediate and catastrophic collapse of the entire Western line. Seeing Kobayakawa's betrayal, other Western lords who had been secretly in league with Ieyasu also switched sides, turning on their comrades. The Western Army, attacked from the front and now the flank, disintegrated into a panicked rout. The battle, which had been a bloody stalemate just moments before, was over in an instant. The field of Sekigahara was transformed into a slaughterhouse. In a single day of fighting, the fate of Japan for the next 2.5 centuries was decided. Ishida Mitsunari was captured and publicly executed in Kyoto, and Tokugawa Ieyasu was the undisputed master of the realm. The last great battle of the Sengoku Jidai was over. The rising sun on the morning after the Battle of Sekigahara illuminated a new reality for Japan. The victory of Tokugawa Ieyasu was not merely the triumph of one army over another. It was the end of an entire epoch. The century of chaos was over, and the long, slow process of building a lasting peace could begin. Ieyasu was a master of this new phase of the game. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, he was merciless. He systematically punished the lords of the defeated Western Army, confiscating the lands of 87 daimyo houses. This massive redistribution of territory, the largest in Japanese history, was then used to reward the loyal vassals and the traitors who had secured his victory. by fundamentally redrawing the map of Japan, he shattered the old power bases of his rivals and created a new geography of loyalty, surrounding his own vast domains with those of his most trusted allies. In 1603, the emperor, a willing puppet in this new order, formally granted Ieyasu the title of shogun, officially beginning the Tokugawa Shogunate. In a move of characteristic foresight, Ieyasu did something unprecedented. Just 2 years later, in 1605, he officially retired, abdicating the position of shogun in favor of his third son, Hidetada. This was not an act of surrender, but a brilliant political statement. By having his son appointed, while he himself was still very much alive and in control, he demonstrated to all of Japan that the shogunate was now a hereditary institution of the Tokugawa clan, not a prize to be fought over upon his death. He had learned from the failures of his predecessors and was determined to build a dynasty that would last. Yet one final shadow from the previous age remained. In the massive, impregnable fortress of Osaka Castle, Hideyoshi's young son and heir, Toyotomi Hideyori, was coming of age. The castle had become a magnet for all the disaffected elements of society. Thousands of ronin, masterless samurai, who had been on the losing side at Sekigahara, and daimyo, who still harbored loyalty to the old regime. As long as Hideyori lived, he was a potential rallying cry for rebellion. Ieyasu, patient as ever, waited for his moment. In 1614, using a trivial dispute over a temple bell inscription as a pretext, he declared war on the house of Toyotomi. He marched on Osaka with a colossal army of nearly 200,000 men. The ensuing siege of Osaka was the final great campaign of the samurai era. The castle's defenses, designed by Hideyoshi himself, were magnificent, and the defenders fought with the courage of desperation. The first winter campaign ended in a stalemate. Ieyasu, ever the cunning negotiator, offered a truce. The terms were generous, but included one crucial condition. As a sign of peace, the castle's outer and secondary moats would be filled in. Hideyori's mother, the influential Lady Yodo, foolishly agreed. The moment the moats were filled, crippling the castle's defenses, Ieyasu broke the truce and returned the following summer. The summer campaign of 1615 was a slaughter. The Tokugawa forces stormed the now vulnerable fortress. In the end, Osaka Castle was consumed by flames, and Toyotomi Hideyori and his mother committed suicide. The house of Toyotomi was extinguished, and with it, the last vestiges of military opposition to Tokugawa rule. With all rivals eliminated, Ieyasu and his successors could focus on creating a political system designed not just to rule, but to enforce a permanent, unchallengeable peace. This intricate system of control, known as the Bakuhan system, Baku from Bakufu and Han for the daimyo domains, was a work of political genius. At its heart was the policy of Sankinkotai, or alternate attendance. Every daimyo in Japan was required to build and maintain a lavish residence in the shogunal capital of Edo. They were then forced to spend every other year living in Edo, in personal attendance to the shogun. When they returned to their own domains, their wives and heirs had to remain behind in Edo as permanent hostages. This system was diabolically effective. The constant, ruinously expensive travel and the need to maintain two separate households systematically drained the finances of the daimyo, making it impossible for them to afford to raise armies for a rebellion. Furthermore, the presence of their families in Edo ensured their good behavior. To reinforce this, The Tokugawa government divided the daimyo into three distinct classes based on their relationship to the clan before the Great Battle. The Shinban, or related houses, were branches of the Tokugawa family itself. The Fudai, or hereditary vassals, were those who had supported Ieyasu before Sekigahara. These two trusted groups were given smaller domains strategically located to control the major roads and surround the capital. The third group, the Tazama, or outside lords, were the powerful clans who had submitted to Ieyasu only after his victory. They were the least trusted, and while they were allowed to keep large domains, these were located on the remote periphery of Japan, far from the centers of power. Finally, the shogunate issued the Bukushohato, or laws for the military houses, a strict code of conduct that governed every aspect of a daimyo's life. They were forbidden from repairing their castles, forming alliances, or even arranging marriages for their children without the shogun's express permission. Through this multi-layered web of legal, economic, and social control, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient old warlord, had finally achieved what no one before him ever had. He had caged the samurai and brought the age of war to a definitive end. The intricate web of laws and obligations crafted by Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The fall of Osaka Castle in 1615 marked the end of the last great samurai war. For the next 250 years, Japan would experience an era of domestic tranquility so profound and so lasting that it came to be known as the Taihei, the Great Peace. This long peace would have a transformative and deeply paradoxical effect on the very warrior class that had been created for conflict. The samurai, the men of the sword, now found themselves in a world without war. Their entire reason for being, their martial function, had been made obsolete by the very success of their government. A samurai's two swords, once the tools of his trade, increasingly became mere symbols of his elite status, ceremonial reminders of a violent past in a profoundly peaceful present. The warrior was forced to evolve, his role shifting from soldier to civil administrator, from battlefield commander to quiet bureaucrat, scholar, and guardian of a rigid social order. This internal pacification was accompanied by a deliberate and dramatic turn away from the outside world. The early Tokugawa shoguns grew deeply suspicious of foreign influence, particularly the spread of European Christianity. They saw it as a deeply subversive ideology, one that taught loyalty to a foreign pope over the authority of the shogun, and had the potential to unite their domestic enemies. After a major uprising involving Christian peasants and ronin, which we will explore later, the shogunate decided that the foreign contagion had to be excised completely. Beginning in the 1630s, the third shogun, Iemitsu, issued a series of edicts that effectively sealed Japan off from the rest of the world. This was the beginning of the Sakoku, or closed country period. Under this policy, Japanese citizens were forbidden from traveling abroad under penalty of death. Any Japanese who had been living overseas was forbidden from ever returning. All foreign missionaries were expelled, and the Christian faith was brutally suppressed. All foreign trade was restricted to a single, tiny, man-made island in Nagasaki harbor called Dejima. Here, a small contingent of Dutch traders, who the shogunate believed were interested only in commerce and not in spreading their religion, were allowed to live and work under incredibly strict supervision. This tiny guarded portal at Dejima became Japan's sole window onto the Western world, a controlled channel through which a trickle of European science, medicine, and art, known as rangaku or Dutch learning, could flow, preventing total intellectual isolation. Internally, the Tokugawa Shogunate enforced a rigid social hierarchy based on Neo-Confucian ideals, building upon the foundations Hideyoshi had laid. This was the Shinokosho, or the four-class system. At the very top were the samurai, the ruling elite, who made up about 7% of the population. Below them were the farmers and peasants, who were considered the productive backbone of the nation, revered in theory, but often living difficult, heavily taxed lives. The third class consisted of the artisans, the makers of goods. And at the very bottom of the ladder were the merchants. In the Confucian worldview, merchants were seen as unproductive parasites who created nothing of their own, profiting only from the labor of others. Herein lies the great irony of the Edo period. While the samurai held all the political power and social prestige, their economic foundation was crumbling. A samurai's wealth was measured in rice, paid to him in a fixed stipend from his daimyo. But the long peace fostered a vibrant, cash-based commercial economy. As cities like Edo, the future Tokyo, grew into bustling metropolises with over 1 million people, it was the merchants who thrived. They controlled the rice exchanges, acted as moneylenders, and grew fabulously wealthy. The samurai, with their fixed incomes, found themselves steadily impoverished, many falling into humiliating debt to the very merchant class they were supposed to despise. This economic reversal fueled a spectacular cultural explosion, driven not by the tastes of the samurai, but by the wealth of the merchants. This was the culture of the ukiyo, the floating world, a world of fleeting urban pleasures found in the tea houses, the theaters, and the brothel districts. It was here that new art forms, designed for a popular audience, flourished. The bombastic and colorful dramas of kabuki theater, the intricate storytelling of the bunraku puppet theater, and the elegant 17-syllable poetry of the haiku all came into their own. Most famously, this was the golden age of the ukiyo-e, the woodblock print. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige created stunning mass-produced images of beautiful courtesans, famous actors, and iconic landscapes like the Great Wave off Kanagawa, art that was affordable and accessible to the common townsman. This vibrant, sometimes decadent urban culture, a world away from the stoic, martial ideals of the past, was the unexpected fruit of the Great Peace. The traditional view of the Edo period often paints it as an era of rigid, unchanging feudal stagnation, but modern historians increasingly see it as a period of dynamic internal development, a time when rising literacy, economic growth, and a sophisticated urban culture were quietly laying the foundations for the modern nation that was to come. The long enforced peace of the Tokugawa Shogunate created a profound crisis of identity for the samurai. For centuries, their entire existence, their social status, and their values had been defined by the crucible of war. Now, with the country pacified and locked down, they were a class of warriors with no wars to fight. Their economic power was steadily draining away into the hands of a vibrant merchant class, and their stoic, martial culture was being eclipsed by the colorful, pleasure-seeking world of the ukiyo, the samurai, who had once been the undisputed masters of the battlefield, were now in danger of becoming irrelevant anachronisms in a world they themselves had created. To survive, they had to reinvent themselves. If they could no longer justify their privileged position at the top of the social ladder through military prowess, they had to find a new justification. The answer was to transform their role from the nation's soldiers into the nation's soul. They would rule not by force of arms, but by force of superior moral character. It was in this climate of existential anxiety that the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was truly born. While the old Bushi of the Genpei and Sengoku periods had lived by a raw, unwritten code of loyalty and honor, they would not have recognized the term Bushido. It was a concept forged in peace, a conscious effort by Edo period samurai intellectuals to take the scattered virtues of their ancestors and weave them into a coherent and systematic philosophy. It was a way of looking back at a violent past to find meaning in a peaceful present. This new philosophy was a blend of three major intellectual currents. The first was the traditional warrior ethos, with its emphasis on courage, martial skill, and loyalty. The second, and most influential, was Neo-Confucianism, which the Tokugawa Shogunate had adopted as its official state ideology. Neo-Confucianism provided a blueprint for a perfectly ordered society, and it stressed virtues like filial piety, social harmony, and above all, absolute loyalty, jugi, to one's superior. Under this influence, the old intensely personal loyalty of a warrior to his immediate lord was transformed into a more abstract, bureaucratic loyalty to the shogunate and the entire social order. The ideal samurai was now a gentleman scholar, a man of letters as well as arms, whose duty was to govern with justice and wisdom. The third current was Zen Buddhism, which had long been associated with the warrior class. Zen provided the psychological tools for this new role, emphasizing rigorous self-discipline, mental fortitude, and a calm acceptance of fate, including death. Through practices like meditation, a samurai could cultivate a mind that was free from distraction and fear, allowing him to act with serene resolve, whether in a duel or at his desk. Several key texts from this period attempted to define this new warrior ideal. Early theorists like Yamaga Soko argued that a samurai's primary function in peacetime was to serve as a living moral exemplar for the lower classes, embodying righteousness so that the farmers, artisans, and merchants could go about their business without needing to think about it. The most famous and most radical text associated with Bushido is the Hagakure, or In the Shadow of Leaves. It was compiled in the early 18th century from the conversations of a retired samurai named Yamamoto Tsunetomo. The Hagakure is not a balanced philosophical treatise. It is a deeply nostalgic and romanticized lament for a lost golden age of the warrior. It is filled with a fanatical and almost obsessive devotion to the idea of death. Its most famous and often misunderstood line declares, "The way of the samurai is found in death." For Tsunetomo, a bureaucrat living more than a century after the last great battle, this meant that a samurai should live with a constant awareness of his own mortality, ready to die for his lord at a moment's notice, without a second thought. This readiness to die was what gave his life meaning and purity. The actual influence of the Hagakure during the Edo period is a subject of historical debate. For most of its existence, it was a secret text, circulated only within the small domain where its author lived. It only became famous across Japan in the early 20th century, when it was rediscovered and promoted by ultranationalists to foster a militaristic spirit. It is likely not a reflection of mainstream samurai thought, which was far more practical and bureaucratic, but rather an extreme expression of a deep-seated nostalgia for a more authentic warrior past. A more practical, though still deeply philosophical work was Miyamoto Musashi's The Book of Five Rings. Written around 1645, it was primarily a manual on swordsmanship and strategy, but it was also infused with a Zen-like approach to self-mastery and the pursuit of perfection. Together, these texts and ideas created an idealized image of the samurai, a stoic warrior philosopher who was loyal, brave, and always ready for death. This powerful ideal often stood in stark contrast to the mundane reality of the average Edo samurai's life, which was more likely to be a struggle with debt and paperwork than a glorious last stand. Bushido was the beautiful, necessary myth the samurai told themselves to give their lives meaning in an age of peace. The lofty philosophical ideals of Bushido were forged in an era of peace, a nostalgic look back at a past that was rapidly receding into memory. But in the early years of the 18th century, a dramatic and bloody incident would erupt in the heart of the shogun's capital. An event that seemed to prove that the ancient warrior spirit was not dead, but merely sleeping. It was a real-world saga of loyalty, revenge, and sacrifice that would become Japan's national epic, a story that perfectly embodied the very virtues the samurai class was struggling to define for itself. It is the tale of the 47 Ronin. A Ronin, or wave man, was a masterless samurai. In the stable, hierarchical world of Edo Japan, this was a deeply unfortunate and often desperate status. When a daimyo died without an heir, or had his domain confiscated by the shogunate for some transgression, his samurai retainers were cast adrift. Stripped of their rank, their income, and their social purpose, they became a floating population, some finding new masters, others becoming mercenaries or teachers, and many descending into poverty and banditry. They were a constant and unsettling reminder of the fragility of a samurai's position. The story begins in the spring of 1701 within the heavily guarded walls of Edo Castle itself. A young and earnest provincial daimyo named Asano Naganori had been given the important task of arranging a reception for envoys from the emperor's court in Kyoto. Asano, being from the countryside, was unfamiliar with the labyrinthine intricacies of court protocol and was placed under the tutelage of a powerful and deeply arrogant official of the shogunate, Kira Yoshinaka. For reasons that remain a historical mystery, Kira took a strong dislike to the young lord and subjected him to a campaign of constant public humiliation and insults. The popular version of the story, immortalized in the famous kabuki play Chushingura, claims that Kira was a greedy man, furious that Asano had not offered him a sufficiently large bribe for his instruction. Whatever the cause, the proud daimyo was pushed to his breaking point. Inside a corridor of the shogun's palace, Asano finally snapped. He drew his short sword, an act that was itself a capital crime within the castle walls, and lunged at Kira, wounding him on the shoulder and face before they were separated. The shogun's justice was swift and severe. For the unforgivable crime of drawing a weapon in Edo Castle, Asano Naganori was ordered to commit seppuku that very same day. His domain of Akko was confiscated, and his family was stripped of its rank. Overnight, his 300 loyal samurai became ronin. In the eyes of the Bakufu, the matter was closed. But for the samurai of Akko, a grave injustice had been done. Their lord had been forced to kill himself, while the man who had provoked him, Kira, had received no punishment at all. Their honor, and that of their dead master, was left stained and unsatisfied. The clan's principal chamberlain, a wise and patient man named Oishi Kuranosuke, became the leader of the now masterless retainers. While most of the former samurai dispersed to find new lives, a core group of about 50 men, led by Oishi, swore a secret blood oath to avenge their lord, no matter the cost. They knew they were being watched by spies loyal to Kira and the shogunate, so they embarked on a brilliant and deeply painful campaign of deception. To lull their enemies into a false sense of security, they scattered across the country. Oishi himself moved to Kyoto and cultivated the image of a broken man. He frequented the city's pleasure districts, spent his days in a drunken stupor, and allowed himself to be publicly mocked and shamed, all while secretly coordinating the conspiracy. After nearly 2 years of this elaborate charade, when Kira was convinced that the Akko samurai were nothing more than pathetic cowards, Oishi knew the time was right. On a cold, snowy night in the 12th month of 1702, 47 of the Ronin gathered in Edo. They launched a meticulously planned and flawlessly executed surprise attack on Kira Yoshinaka's lavish mansion. Divided into 2 assault teams, they quickly overcame the mansion's guards. After an intense search, they found the terrified official hiding in a storage shed. They respectfully offered him the chance to die honorably by committing seppuku, but he refused, so they killed him, severing his head with the same short sword their master had used in his own final moments. Their vengeance complete, the Ronin did not flee. They marched in a solemn procession across the city to the Sengoku Temple, the final resting place of their lord, Asano. There, they carefully washed Kira's head in a well and placed it as an offering before their master's tomb. They then sat down and calmly waited to be arrested. Their actions presented the shogunate with a terrible dilemma. By law, they were criminals who had engaged in a forbidden vendetta and murdered a government official, yet their unwavering loyalty and patient sacrifice were a perfect, living embodiment of the Bushido ideals that the Tokugawa regime itself championed. The public was electrified by their story and hailed them as heroes. After months of debate, the shogun arrived at a decision that acknowledged this conflict. The 46 surviving Ronin were not to be executed as common criminals. Instead, they were granted the high honor of dying as true samurai. They were all ordered to commit seppuku, which they did, and were then buried in a row next to their beloved master. Their story immediately became a legend, a stark and bloody affirmation that even in an age of profound peace, the soul of the warrior was still alive. The story of the 47 Ronin seemed to reaffirm the core tenets of the samurai identity in an age of peace. It was a tale of loyalty, honor, and sacrifice, a drama that played out within the accepted rules of the Tokugawa social order. But another, far larger and bloodier event would rock the shogunate in the early decades of its rule, a conflict that would reveal the deep anxieties simmering beneath the surface of the Great Peace. This was the Shimabara Rebellion, the last major war fought on Japanese soil for over 200 years, and it was a conflict that would directly lead to the policy of national isolation we have already discussed, the Sengoku. To understand it, we must step back briefly to the chaotic century that came before. When the first Portuguese traders arrived in Japan in 1543, they brought more than just firearms. They brought a new faith, Christianity. In 1549, the Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier landed in Kyushu and began a period of intense missionary activity that is sometimes known as Japan's Christian century. The faith found surprising success. Some powerful daimyo in the south, eager to gain preferential access to the lucrative Portuguese trade in silk and firearms, converted and even ordered their domains to do the same. The new religion also found fertile ground among the common people, who were drawn to its message of salvation and its condemnation of the wealthy, corrupt Buddhist institutions. The great unifiers, Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, had at first tolerated the missionaries, seeing them as a useful tool to weaken their Buddhist rivals. But Hideyoshi eventually grew deeply suspicious of this foreign faith, fearing that its followers' allegiance to a distant pope might undermine his own authority. He initiated the first persecutions, and his successors in the Tokugawa Shogunate would turn this suspicion into a systematic and brutal campaign of eradication. They saw Christianity as a deeply subversive ideology, an existential threat to the strict Neo-Confucian social order they were trying to build. By the 1630s, the faith had been driven underground, its followers, the Kirishitan, forced to practice their religion in secret. The stage was now set for the final tragic confrontation. The rebellion broke out in late 1637 in the Shimabara Peninsula and the nearby Amakusa Islands, a region of Kyushu that had been a heartland of Japanese Catholicism. But its causes were not purely religious. The local peasants were suffering under the crushing tyranny of their daimyo, Matsukura Katsuie, who taxed them with merciless cruelty to finance the construction of his new castle. Years of famine had pushed the populace to the brink of starvation. In this climate of utter desperation, the shared Christian faith of many of the peasants provided a powerful ideology of resistance, a promise of deliverance in the next world for their suffering in this one. The rebellion was a mass uprising of more than 37,000 people. Starving peasants, angry fishermen, and, crucially, a large number of masterless ronin who provided the movement with military leadership. The figurehead of the rebellion was a charismatic and mysterious 16-year-old boy named Amakusa Shiro. He was hailed by his followers as a messiah, a heaven-sent leader who could perform miracles and would lead them to salvation. Under his banner, emblazoned with Christian iconography, the rebels rampaged through the countryside, killing the hated local officials and burning the Buddhist temples. They then fortified themselves in the ruins of Hara Castle, a strategically located fortress on a coastal bluff, and prepared to face the wrath of the shogun. The Tokugawa Shogunate was shocked by the scale and ferocity of the uprising. It mobilized a colossal army of over 125,000 samurai to crush the rebellion. But the samurai, who had now been at peace for over a generation, were unaccustomed to large-scale siege warfare. The rebels, fighting with the fervor of religious zealots, managed to hold off the shogun's massive army for months. In a deeply ironic turn of events, the Bakufu, in its quest to stamp out a foreign religion, even requested the help of the Protestant Dutch traders at Dejima. The Dutch sent a ship, which bombarded the castle with its cannons, though with little real effect. Ultimately, however, the outcome was inevitable. After a siege of nearly 4 months, the rebels' supplies of food and ammunition were exhausted. In the spring of 1638, the shogunate's forces launched a final, overwhelming assault. They swarmed over the walls and systematically massacred nearly everyone inside the castle. Men, women, and children were put to the sword. Amakusa Shiro was killed, and his head was taken back to be displayed on a pike in Nagasaki as a grim warning. The Shimabara rebellion was over. It was a catastrophe that confirmed the shogunate's deepest fears. They now saw an inextricable link between Christianity and rebellion. In the immediate aftermath, the final and most stringent Sakoku edicts were issued. The last of the Portuguese were expelled, and the policy of near-total isolation was locked into place. The Shimabara Rebellion, the last great battle of the samurai era, had ended not with a clash of warrior clans, but with the slaughter of desperate peasants, and its legacy would be 2 centuries of silence. The brutal suppression of the Shimabara Rebellion and the subsequent closing of the country had ushered in 2 centuries of profound and dreamlike peace. While the nations of the West were being convulsed by the scientific enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the violent birth of globe-spanning colonial empires, Japan existed in a state of suspended animation. The Tokugawa Shogunate, with its intricate systems of control, had created a stable, self-contained world, a society where a samurai's life was governed by the timeless rituals of Bushido and the slow turning of the seasons. But the world outside had not been sleeping. It had been transformed by steam, by steel, and by an insatiable hunger for new markets and resources. In the summer of 1853, this new world arrived uninvited, belching black smoke, and shattered the tranquility of the Edo period forever. On the 8th of July, 4 strange vessels sailed into Edo Bay, moving with an unnatural power against the wind and tide. These were the Kurofune, the Black Ships. They were a squadron of the United States Navy, 2 steam-powered frigates, and 2 sloops of war, under the command of Commodore Matthew C. Perry. To the Japanese, who had only ever seen sailing vessels, the sight of these massive paddle-wheeled warships, their hulls painted black with tar, moving as if by some demonic force, was an terrifying and apocalyptic vision. Perry had been dispatched by the American president with a simple mission: to force Japan to open its borders. The United States, a rising power with a new coastline on the Pacific, needed coaling stations for its steam-powered whaling ships and merchant vessels on their way to China. It also demanded better treatment for shipwrecked American sailors, who were often harshly treated under Japan's strict isolationist laws. Perry was a veteran naval officer, and he understood the language of power. This was not a diplomatic request. It was an ultimatum, a textbook example of gunboat diplomacy. He deliberately defied Japanese protocol, refusing to deal with low-ranking officials and sailing his fleet menacingly close to the shogunal capital of Edo. His ships were armed with state-of-the-art Baishan's shell guns, capable of firing explosive shells that could reduce any of the city's wooden buildings to splinters. To demonstrate this awesome power, he fired blank rounds from his 64 cannons, a thunderous roar that echoed across the bay and struck terror into the hearts of the populace. He presented the Japanese with a white flag, telling them to use it if they wished to avoid a bombardment, and a letter from President Millard Fillmore. He demanded that the letter be accepted by a high-ranking representative of the shogun and announced that he would sail away, but that he would return the following year with a much larger fleet to receive Japan's answer. The arrival of the black ships plunged the Tokugawa Bakufu into a state of national crisis. For the first time in over 200 years, the shogunate was utterly powerless. Their samurai, with their swords and antique cannons, were helpless against the industrial might of the West. They were caught in an impossible dilemma. If they acceded to the American demands, they would be abandoning the sacred Sakoku policy, the very cornerstone of Tokugawa authority, and would appear weak and incompetent to the powerful daimyo. If they refused, Perry would likely bombard Edo, an act of war they could not possibly win, which would be an even greater humiliation. In a move that signaled its own profound uncertainty, the shogunate did something it had never done before. It circulated the president's letter to all the daimyo and asked for their advice. This act of consultation, intended to build consensus, instead shattered the shogunate's aura of absolute authority and opened the floodgates to 2 centuries of pent-up political debate and dissent. As promised, Perry returned in February of 1854, this time with a fleet of 9 warships. The shogunate, having debated for a year and found no viable alternative, had no choice but to capitulate. On March the 31st, 1854, they signed the Convention of Kanagawa. It was not yet a full trade agreement, but it opened 2 provincial ports to American ships for refueling and reprovisioning, guaranteed good treatment for shipwrecked sailors, and allowed for the establishment of a permanent American consulate on Japanese soil. The door had been wedged open. This treaty was soon followed by a series of similar and even more intrusive, unequal treaties with the other Western powers, Great Britain, Russia, and France. These treaties granted foreigners the right of extraterritoriality, meaning they were subject to their own laws, not Japan's, and stripped Japan of the right to set its own tariffs on imported goods. It was a national humiliation, and the shogun, who for centuries had been the undisputed military protector of the nation, was now seen as the man who had failed to protect it. A fierce and violent backlash was about to begin, and it would be led by a new generation of samurai who believed the only way to save Japan was to destroy the shogunate that had shamed it. The signing of the unequal treaties was a profound humiliation that cracked the very foundation of the Tokugawa regime. The shogun, whose ultimate duty was to protect Japan from foreign threats, had been exposed as powerless. The great peace, which had been the shogunate's crowning achievement, now seemed like a long sleep during which the rest of the world had grown into a fearsome giant. The final 15 years of Tokugawa rule, a period known as the Bakumatsu, or end of the Bakufu, would be a time of intense, chaotic, and bloody upheaval, as the nation's samurai class tore itself apart, debating the future of a country that had been violently shaken from its long isolation. The political storm that erupted coalesced around a simple but explosive 4-character slogan, Sono Choi. This meant, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian, and it became the rallying cry for a generation of angry and disillusioned samurai. The second half of the slogan, Joy, was a xenophobic and reactionary cry to abrogate the humiliating treaties, cut all ties with the West, and drive the newly arrived foreigners back into the sea. It was a call to restore the sacred purity of Japan and return to the comfortable silence of isolation. The first half of the slogan, Sono, was even more revolutionary. It was a direct and unprecedented challenge to the legitimacy of the shogun himself. For centuries, the emperor in Kyoto had been a revered but politically powerless religious figurehead. This new movement argued that the shogun was a military usurper, and that the only true and legitimate ruler of Japan was the emperor. They sought to overthrow the bakufu and restore the emperor to his rightful place at the center of political power. The most fervent advocates of this new ideology were a group of radical activists known as the Shishi, or men of high purpose. They were mostly young, idealistic, and often low-ranking samurai from the Great Tazama, or outside domains, particularly the powerful western domains of Choshu and Satsuma. These were the domains that had been on the losing side at the Battle of Sekigahara 2.5 centuries earlier, and they had long harbored a deep resentment of Tokugawa rule. The Shishi saw the shogun's capitulation to the west as the ultimate proof of its corruption and weakness, filled with a potent mixture of nationalist fervor and a romanticized vision of Bushido. They unleashed a campaign of political terrorism and assassination, seeking to destabilize the shogunate and ignite a national revolution. The streets of Kyoto became a killing ground. They assassinated shogunate officials, scholars of Western learning, and any foreigner they could find. The most powerful minister of the shogunate, Inaosuke, was cut down in broad daylight just outside the gates of Edo Castle. It was an era of government by assassination. The bakufu, caught between the demands of the Western powers and the violence of the domestic radicals, was paralyzed, unable to satisfy either side. The Shishi's campaign of expelling the barbarian, however, soon collided with the hard reality of Western military power. In 1863, samurai from the domain of Satsuma killed a British merchant who had failed to show them proper respect. In response, a squadron of the British Royal Navy sailed to the Satsuma capital of Kagoshima and, in a devastating bombardment, reduced much of the city to ashes. The following year, samurai from the domain of Choshu, on their own initiative, fired upon foreign ships passing through the Shimonoseki Strait. The Western powers responded with a combined fleet of American, British, French, and Dutch warships that systematically destroyed the Choshu coastal forts and sank their ships. These brutal bombardments were a humiliating defeat, but they were also a crucial education. The leaders of Satsuma and Choshu, the two most powerful anti-shogunate domains, learned a valuable and sobering lesson. Their swords, their courage, and their Bushido spirit were utterly useless against industrial-era cannons and warships. The dream of joy, of expelling the barbarian, was an impossible fantasy. To survive, they would have to adapt. Their strategy underwent a radical transformation. The goal was no longer to expel the West, but to master its secrets. The new slogan became Fukoku Kyohei: enrich the country, strengthen the army. They realized that to resist the West, they must first become like the West. They began to secretly send their brightest young samurai to study in Europe and America, and they used their resources to import Western rifles, cannons, and ships, building their own modern, disciplined armies, trained by Western advisors. Their ultimate goal, however, remained the same: the overthrow of the Tokugawa Shogunate. But now, they sought to replace it not with a return to a mythical past, but with a new, strong, centralized government under the emperor that could lead a national program of rapid modernization. In 1866, the two great rival domains of Satsuma and Choshu, long bitter enemies, forged a secret military alliance. This Sacho alliance created an anti-shogunate force so powerful that the Bakufu could no longer hope to defeat it. The final act of the long drama of Tokugawa rule was about to begin. The stage was set for a civil war that would pit the last defenders of the shogunate against a new generation of samurai who had learned that the future of Japan would be forged not with the katana, but with the rifle. The secret alliance between the two great domains of Satsuma and Choshu had created an unstoppable political and military force. The Tokugawa Shogunate, which had ruled Japan with an iron fist for over 2.5 centuries, was now isolated, discredited, and facing an existential threat from its own most powerful vassals. The country was on the razor's edge of a full-scale civil war, a conflict that could potentially devastate the nation and leave it vulnerable to the very Western powers that now watched from their legations and warships. The man who sat at the center of this storm was the 15th and final shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu. He was a sharp, intelligent, and reform-minded man, and he understood better than most that the old system was broken beyond repair. He knew that the Bakufu could no longer govern effectively in this new globalized era. In a last desperate attempt to save his clan and avoid a catastrophic war, Yoshinobu made a historic decision. In late 1867, he formally resigned his post as shogun and officially returned governing authority to the young Emperor Meiji, who had just ascended the throne. It was a calculated political gambit. Yoshinobu's plan was not to simply surrender power, but to transform the government into a new council of the great daimyo, presided over by the emperor. In this new system, he reasoned, the Tokugawa clan, still the wealthiest and most powerful landholders in the country, would remain as a kind of prime minister, the first among equals. It was a peaceful revolution, designed to preserve Tokugawa preeminence in a modernized political framework. But the radical leaders of the Sacho alliance had no intention of allowing their old masters to retain any semblance of power. For them, the goal was not reform, but complete and total destruction of the old regime. In January of 1868, their troops staged a coup in Kyoto, seizing control of the Imperial Palace. They swiftly had the young emperor issue a formal edict that abolished the office of the shogun, stripped the Tokugawa clan of all its titles, and most provocatively, ordered the confiscation of all their lands. It was a declaration of war in all but name, a deliberate move to provoke a military response from the Tokugawa loyalists. Yoshinobu, now branded an enemy of the court, had no choice but to fight. The Boshin War, the War of the Year of the Dragon, had begun. The first and most decisive engagement of the war took place just south of Kyoto, at the battles of Toba and Fushimi. The shogunate forces, marching on the capital to free the emperor from his Sacho captors, were numerically superior. They were, however, a relic of a bygone age, a feudal host composed of traditionally armed samurai from various allied domains, supplemented by a few modern units. The Sacho army, by contrast, was smaller, but it was a modern, disciplined force, well equipped with the latest American and European breech-loading rifles and Armstrong guns, and led by commanders who understood modern tactics. As the shogunate forces advanced, the Sacho troops suddenly unfurled the official gold and red imperial brocade banner. This single act was the turning point. By raising the emperor's standard, The Sacho forces officially became the Imperial Army, and the shogun's men were instantly branded as rebels, traitors fighting against the divine throne. Many of the daimyo allied with the shogun, seeing the banner, immediately switched sides or simply withdrew their troops from the field. The shogunate army, its morale shattered, was swiftly routed. The defeat at Toba-Fushimi caused a complete collapse of Yoshinobu's will to fight. He abandoned his remaining forces in Osaka and fled by ship back to his capital of Edo. The reasons for his flight are still debated by historians. Was he a coward, or was he a patriot who chose to sacrifice his own cause to prevent a long and destructive civil war that would only invite foreign intervention? Whatever his motive, his departure sealed the fate of his regime. The Imperial Army, led by the formidable Saigo Takamori of Satsuma, marched eastward and surrounded Edo, a final, climactic battle that would have consumed the great metropolis seemed inevitable. But it was averted through negotiations between the two commanders. The shogunate's forces surrendered, and Edo was occupied peacefully. Still, the war was not quite over. Die-hard loyalists in the north, particularly the samurai of the Aizu domain, who were renowned for their martial ferocity, refused to surrender and fought on for several more months before being brutally crushed. The last holdouts were a group of naval officers and samurai led by the admiral Enomoto Takeaki. They fled with the remnants of the shogunate's fleet to the northern island of Hokkaido, where they established the short-lived Republic of Ezo, a final, defiant attempt to preserve the samurai form of government. In the spring of 1869, the new Imperial Army and Navy landed on the island, and after the final Battle of Hakodate, the Republic collapsed. The last samurai resistance was broken. The Boshin War was over. The Tokugawa Shogunate was dead, and a new era under a new emperor was about to dawn. The Boshin War had ended with the complete triumph of the imperial loyalist forces. The shogun was gone, and the emperor, a teenager named Mutsuhito, who would adopt the reign name Meiji, meaning enlightened rule, was now the official head of state. The leaders of this new government, a small, tightly knit group of brilliant and pragmatic young samurai from Satsuma and Choshu, immediately began the most rapid and radical top-to-bottom transformation that any nation has ever experienced. The Meiji Restoration, as it came to be known, was not a return to the past, as its name might suggest. It was a full-blown revolution, a desperate, headlong rush to remake Japan into a modern, industrial nation-state capable of standing on equal terms with the powerful Western nations that now loomed over it. The new government's intentions were made clear in the Charter Oath of 1868, a brief but momentous document issued in the emperor's name. It promised that deliberative assemblies would be established, that all classes of people would be united in carrying out the administration of the state, and in two phrases that would define the era, it declared that the evil customs of the past shall be broken off, and that knowledge shall be sought throughout the world. This was a clear repudiation of the old shogunal system and the policy of isolation. The new slogan of the era was Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, and a frenzy of westernization began to sweep the country. The oligarchs, who now ruled Japan, knew that to build a strong modern nation, they first had to dismantle the old feudal structure that had defined the country for 700 years. Their primary target was the semi-independent domains, The Han, ruled by the daimyo. In a masterstroke of political maneuvering in 1871, the government announced the abolition of the domains. The daimyo were persuaded to return their land registers to the emperor, and in their place, the country was redivided into a new system of prefectures, whose governors were appointed by and answered directly to the central government in the newly renamed capital of Tokyo, formerly Edo. This single edict, accomplished with remarkably little bloodshed, erased the daimyo as a ruling class and destroyed the very foundation of the feudal system. Having dismantled the old political geography, the Meiji leaders next turned to the social structure. The rigid four-class system of samurai, farmer, artisan, and merchant was formally abolished. All Japanese were now theoretically equal commoners under the emperor. These changes, which were necessary for the creation of a modern nation, came as a series of devastating blows to the samurai, the very class who had instigated and fought for the restoration. Their entire world was systematically dismantled by the government they had helped create. Their privileged status as a hereditary ruling class was gone. In 1873, the government established a national army based on universal conscription, drafting soldiers from the peasantry. This ended the samurai's traditional monopoly on the profession of arms. A farmer's son with a rifle was now the defender of the nation. Their economic privileges were stripped away as well. The hereditary rice stipends that had been the samurai's livelihood for centuries were first converted into interest-bearing government bonds and then eventually eliminated altogether. This drove hundreds of thousands of samurai who had no experience in commerce or agriculture into sudden and humiliating poverty. Finally, in 1876, the government delivered the most profound psychological blow of all. It issued an edict called the Heitere, which banned the public wearing of the daisho, the iconic pair of long and short swords. The swords were the soul of the samurai, the ultimate and most visible symbol of their identity and their honor. To forbid them was to declare that the samurai, as a distinct class, no longer existed. The pace of change was dizzying. The government adopted the Gregorian calendar, built the country's first railways and telegraph lines, established a modern postal service and a national education system, and sent a high-level delegation, the Iwakura Mission, on a nearly 2-year journey around the world to study Western technology, politics, and industry. The samurai top knot was abandoned in favor of Western haircuts, and government officials began to wear European-style suits and uniforms. This rush to modernize has led to a great historical debate. Was the Meiji Restoration a true restoration of ancient imperial rule, or was it a radical revolution? The leaders of the movement always framed it as a restoration, a return to a golden age before the shoguns had usurped the emperor's power. This was a brilliant piece of political propaganda that gave their actions a powerful sense of legitimacy and tradition. But in practice, the government they created, a centralized bureaucracy with a conscript army, a modern industrial base, and a constitution modeled on that of Prussia, was a complete break from the past. A small group of samurai oligarchs had effectively hijacked the imperial institution to legitimize a revolutionary remaking of their entire civilization. For the samurai class as a whole, it was a bitter and confusing time. They had started a revolution to restore Japan's honor, only to find that the new Japan had no place for them. The sweeping reforms of the Meiji Restoration had remade Japan in a breathtakingly short period, but they had come at a tremendous cost to the very class that had initiated them. The samurai, now officially known as the Shizoku, had been stripped of their status, their income, their monopoly on violence, and even the right to wear their swords, the very symbol of their soul. They were a class adrift, men trained for a world that no longer existed, watching with a mixture of confusion and resentment as merchants grew rich and peasants were handed rifles and told they were now the defenders of the nation. For many, the new Japan, with its Western fashions, its steam trains, and its talk of parliaments, felt like a betrayal of the true Japanese spirit. This deep well of discontent was about to overflow into one last tragic and glorious act of defiance. The figurehead for this samurai anger was the greatest hero of the Restoration itself, Saigo Takamori. A giant of a man, both physically and in terms of his moral stature, Saigo was the commander from Satsuma who had led the imperial forces to victory in the Boshin War. He was widely seen as the embodiment of the true samurai virtues: courage, sincerity, and an unwavering loyalty to the emperor. But Saigo had grown deeply disillusioned with the new government he had helped to create. He detested the petty politics, the growing bureaucracy, and what he saw as the corrupting influence of westernization. In 1873, after a fierce disagreement with other government leaders over a proposal to invade Korea, which he saw as a way to give the restless samurai a noble purpose, Saigo resigned from all his posts and returned to his home domain of Satsuma. In his native Kagoshima, he became the center of a growing traditionalist movement. He used his personal fortune to establish a network of private schools, or shigako, which focused on the traditional samurai arts and ethics. These schools soon became a de facto private army, populated by thousands of discontented Shizoku who were fanatically loyal not to the government in Tokyo, but to Saigo himself. Satsuma became a state within a state, a bastion of the old samurai way of life, and the Meiji government watched with increasing alarm. The final spark came in the winter of 1877. The government in Tokyo, fearing the intentions of Saigo's followers, attempted to remove the weapons and ammunition from the government arsenal in Kagoshima. Enraged by this provocation, the students of Saigo's academies spontaneously raided the arsenal and seized the weapons for themselves. The situation escalated rapidly. Saigo, a man caught between his loyalty to the emperor and his loyalty to his followers, felt he had no choice. He reluctantly agreed to lead the rebels, not in an outright rebellion against the throne, but in a great armed march to Tokyo to advise the emperor and confront the corrupt officials who had, in his view, misled him. The Satsuma Rebellion, the final civil war of samurai Japan, had begun. Saigo's army numbered around 30,000 men, a force composed almost entirely of traditional samurai fighting to preserve their way of life. They were met by the new Imperial Japanese Army, a larger force of commoner conscripts, but one that was professionally trained and equipped with the latest Western rifles, artillery, and the support of a modern navy. It was a direct contest between the old and the new Japan. The rebels' first major objective was to capture the Imperial garrison at Kumamoto Castle. They expected the conscript soldiers to break and run in the face of a true samurai charge. But the conscripts, fighting for their new nation, held their ground with astonishing bravery. For nearly 2 months, The small imperial garrison withstood a massive siege, completely stalling Saigo's advance and allowing the main government army to mobilize. It was a stunning and psychologically devastating proof that the age of the samurai warrior was truly over. The war lasted for nearly 8 months, a bloody and brutal campaign fought across the island of Kyushu. The samurai rebels, despite their incredible courage and swordsmanship, were systematically ground down by the superior numbers and overwhelming firepower of the imperial army. Saigo's forces were eventually pushed all the way back to Kagoshima. In September of 1877, the last 500 surviving samurai, with Saigo at their head, made their final stand on a small hill called Shiroyama. They were surrounded by over 30,000 imperial troops. After a ferocious all-night artillery bombardment, the imperial forces began their final assault at dawn. Saigo, mortally wounded in the thigh, turned to his most loyal retainer, who, acting as his second, cut off his head to save him from the dishonor of capture. Seeing their leader fall, the last of the samurai drew their swords, charged downhill into the relentless fire of the army's Gatling guns and rifles, and were annihilated to the last man. The rising sun that morning illuminated a field littered with the bodies of the last true samurai. Their rebellion was crushed, and their class, as a military and political force, was extinguished forever. The charge at Shiroyama was the final bloody punctuation mark at the end of the long story of the samurai as a military force. The defeat of Saigo Takamori and his traditionalist army was a national trauma, but it was also a catharsis. It demonstrated, with heartbreaking finality, that there could be no turning back. The way of the sword had been definitively broken by the way of the rifle, and the future of Japan lay not in its feudal past, but in its industrializing present. With the last armed resistance crushed, the Meiji government now had a free hand to complete the process of dismantling the class that had ruled Japan for 700 years. In a strange and telling epilogue to the rebellion, the government that had hunted him down and killed him began the process of rehabilitating Saigo's image. He was posthumously pardoned, and his memory was elevated to that of a tragic national hero, a man of pure and selfless spirit who had fought for his ideals. This clever co-opting of their greatest opponent's legacy helped to pacify the remaining discontent among the former samurai, framing his rebellion not as treason, but as the last honorable gasp of a noble but bygone age. With the threat of insurrection now gone, the government moved to erase the final legal and social distinctions that set the samurai, the shizoku, apart from the rest of the population. Their hereditary stipends, which had already been converted into bonds, were now fully settled, often at a fraction of their original value, leaving the majority of the class with little capital. The final act was the formal abolition of the shizoku status itself. The name was erased from the official registers. With the stroke of a pen, the samurai class ceased to be a legal entity. A new European-style peerage, the kazoku, was created for the old court nobility and the former daimyo. But the millions of ordinary samurai were now, in the eyes of the law, simply heimin, or commoners, indistinguishable from the farmers and merchants they had once ruled. The dissolution of the samurai as a legal class, however, did not mean that all of its members shared the same fate. Their futures depended almost entirely on the rank and domain from which they had come. For the elite, the transition was almost seamless. The same small group of high-ranking samurai from the victorious domains of Satsuma and Choshu, who had led the restoration, simply traded their swords for Western-style suits and became the new leaders of the nation. They were the Meiji oligarchs, the prime ministers, the cabinet members, the generals of the new army, and the admirals of the new navy. They filled the top ranks of the government bureaucracy and used their connections to establish the great industrial conglomerates, the zaibatsu, that would power Japan's modernization. For them, the restoration was not an end, but a spectacular promotion. The educated, mid-ranking samurai also found a place in the new Japan. Their high rates of literacy and their ingrained sense of discipline made them perfect candidates for the rapidly expanding state apparatus. They became the nation's school teachers, its police officers, its civil servants, and its junior army officers, forming the backbone of the new middle class. But for the vast majority of the samurai, particularly the lower-ranking foot soldiers who had made up the bulk of the class, the Meiji Restoration was an unmitigated disaster. With their stipends gone and possessing few practical skills beyond fighting, they were cast into a new and unfamiliar world of commerce and labor. Many tried and failed to become farmers or small businessmen. Many more were forced to sell their family heirlooms, including their precious swords, just to survive. They fell into poverty, becoming rickshaw pullers, laborers, and common workers, a humiliating descent for a class that had once held the power of life and death over the common people. While the samurai as a class was gone, the Meiji state was careful to preserve and reshape its ideology. The concept of Bushido was not discarded. It was nationalized. The fierce personal loyalty that a samurai once owed to his daimyo was skillfully rechanneled into a new, absolute, and fanatical loyalty to the emperor, who was elevated from a mere political figurehead to a living god at the center of a new state religion. The spirit of self-sacrifice for a lord was transformed into the spirit of self-sacrifice for the nation. This new state-sponsored emperor worship, infused with the old warrior virtues, would become the powerful and dangerous ideological engine of Japanese nationalism and militarism in the decades to come. The question of how truly the samurai ended remains a fascinating one. While they vanished as a legal class by the 1880s, their influence lingered. Some historians argue that the hierarchical, loyalty-based structures of modern Japanese corporations and the fierce discipline of its military in the 20th century were direct cultural descendants of the old samurai ethos. The warrior was gone, but his ghost, it seemed, still haunted the halls of modern Japan. The formal dissolution of the Shizoku was the legal end of the samurai, but it was not the end of their story. The warrior was gone, but his spirit, his ethos, and his legend would prove to be remarkably resilient, enduring in the most unexpected corners of modern Japanese society, and eventually capturing the imagination of the entire world. The most immediate and most tragic legacy of the samurai was the Meiji government's masterful co-opting of their code. The new state took the Bushido ideal of selfless loyalty to a lord and magnified it onto a national scale, forging a new, fanatical loyalty to the divine emperor. The samurai's spirit of martial valor and self-sacrifice was repurposed to become the ideological engine of Japanese imperialism. This state-sponsored Bushido would fuel the rise of the Japanese Empire through the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, and ultimately, the catastrophic fire of the Second World War. The kamikaze pilots of that conflict, sacrificing themselves for the emperor, were presented to the world as the ultimate modern-day expression of the samurai spirit. It was a dark and terrible apotheosis of the warrior code. After Japan's devastating defeat in 1945, this militaristic version of Bushido was utterly discredited. In the ashes of the empire, the nation underwent a profound transformation, rejecting militarism and embracing a new identity as a pacifist, democratic nation. For a time, the samurai and their code were viewed as toxic relics of a feudal past that had led the country to ruin. But the spirit of the samurai would re-emerge in a new and far more productive form as Japan began its post-war economic miracle, rebuilding itself into a global industrial powerhouse. Many observers, both Japanese and foreign, saw the shadow of the samurai in the modern Japanese corporation. The fierce loyalty a warrior once gave to his daimyo and his domain seemed to be reborn in the loyalty a Japanese salaryman gave to his company. The dedication to the group over the individual, the incredible discipline, the pursuit of perfection in one's craft, and the system of lifetime employment. All of these were seen as modern secular manifestations of the old clan spirit. The company had become the new domain, the CEO the new lord, and the suit-wearing corporate employee the new samurai. The most direct legacy of the samurai, of course, endures in Japan's martial arts, or Budo. The lethal combat techniques of the feudal warrior, the jutsu, were transformed during the long peace of the Edo period, and again after the Meiji Restoration, into do, or ways. They became paths not just for fighting, but for spiritual and moral self-improvement. In the disciplined movements of kendo, the way of the sword, the graceful grappling of judo, and the flowing circular motions of aikido, the physical techniques and, more importantly, the mental fortitude and strict etiquette of the samurai are preserved and practiced by millions around the world. The warrior's aesthetic sense, particularly his embrace of Zen Buddhism, also continues to profoundly influence the Japanese sense of beauty. The concepts of wabi-sabi, the appreciation for the beauty in imperfection and impermanence, and the elegant simplicity that were cultivated in the tea ceremony and rock gardens, remain cornerstones of Japanese design and art. But perhaps the most powerful and pervasive legacy of the samurai is in the realm of myth. The image of the samurai, the stoic, masterless ronin with his lightning-fast draw, the wise warrior philosopher, the tragic hero fighting for a lost cause, has become a global cultural icon. This is due in no small part to the films of the great director Akira Kurosawa. His masterpieces, like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, did not just tell stories about samurai. They created the archetypes that now define them in the popular imagination. These archetypes were so powerful, they crossed the ocean, with Seven Samurai being famously remade as the Western The Magnificent Seven, and the stoic anti-hero of Yojimbo, providing the direct template for Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name. The influence is seen even in the stars, as George Lucas openly acknowledged that the Jedi Knights of Star Wars, with their master-apprentice relationships, their mystical philosophy, and their laser swords, were directly inspired by the samurai. Today, the samurai continues to be endlessly reinvented in manga, anime, and video games, a testament to the enduring power of the legend. This brings us to the final mystery. How much of this legend is true? The historical samurai was often a far cry from his mythical counterpart. He was frequently a pragmatic, sometimes treacherous, and brutally violent figure in a chaotic world. The popular image we hold today is a romantic composite, a blend of Edo period philosophizing, Meiji-era nationalism, and 20th century cinematic myth-making. Our long journey, from the mounted archers of the ancient tombs to the tragic rebels of Shiroyama, shows a figure that was constantly changing, adapting to the needs of his time. The samurai class is long gone. Its castles are now peaceful parks, and its battlefields are covered by silent forests and bustling cities. But the story they left behind, a timeless tale of loyalty, honor, violence, and the search for meaning in a changing world, continues to whisper to us. And now, as our own long journey through their history comes to a close, may those whispers guide you into a quiet and deeply restful sleep.